At my dad's retirement party, he suddenly shoved me away from the VIP table and shouted that the seat was for his real daughter. I fell to the floor in front of hundreds of guests, humiliated and stunned. But as I was about to leave, my husband stood up. He pointed straight at my dad, and what he said next made the entire ballroom go dead silent. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to toxic family members who underestimated you. My name is Caroline, and I am 33 years old. I work as a forensic accountant specializing in corporate financial fraud. I spend my days tracking hidden money, exposing lies, and tearing down fake empires. As a professional, I know exactly how to spot a fraud from a mile away. I look at balance sheets and see the truth people try desperately to hide. But the biggest fake empire I ever had to dismantle was my own family. I had spent years ignoring the massive red flags in my personal life just to keep the peace. It all came to a head last Saturday night at the Oak Ridge Country Club. The grand ballroom was dripping in crystal chandeliers and imported white roses. My father Thomas was celebrating his retirement as the CEO of Apex Logistics. There were over 300 people in attendance. Board members, politicians, wealthy socialites, and everyone who mattered in our city elite circles were there. My mother Brenda had spent 6 months and arguably a small fortune planning this event to ensure it looked like the crowning achievement of a perfect patriarch. I arrived with my husband David, a corporate attorney who knew exactly how to navigate these high society shark tanks. We were dressed to the nines, playing the part of the supportive daughter and son-in-law. But beneath the expensive fabric and polite smiles, I knew my true place in this family. I was the scapegoat, the one who was never quite good enough. I was the one who had to take out massive student loans to pay for my own education, while my younger sister Stephanie got brand new luxury cars and designer wardrobes for simply existing. The evening was flowing smoothly until dinner was announced over the speakers. David and I made our way to the front of the room, heading toward the large round table marked with a gold-plated VIP family sign. I pulled out my chair, smoothing my dress, and began to sit down. Out of nowhere, a heavy hand clamped down on the back of my chair and yanked it violently backwards. I lost my balance completely. My heels slipped on the polished marble floor, and I crashed hard onto the ground. The heavy thud echoed through the silent ballroom. Hundreds of heads turned our way. The soft music playing in the background seemed to fade away, and conversations died instantly. I looked up, stunned and embarrassed, only to see my father standing over me, his face twisted in a scowl of pure disdain. "Get out," he hissed loud enough for the neighboring tables to hear perfectly clearly. "That seat is for my real daughter." I sat there on the cold marble, the humiliation burning my cheeks as a hot flush spread across my face. Through the grand double doors of the ballroom strolled my younger sister Stephanie, clinging tightly to the arm of her husband Terrence. Terrence was a tall, striking African-American man who masked his deceit behind a charismatic smile and custom-tailored Italian suits. He was a self-proclaimed cryptocurrency entrepreneur who was always boasting about his latest digital investments. They were 45 minutes late, completely unapologetic, and looking extremely pleased with the chaotic scene unfolding before them. My mother Brenda rushed over, her heavy silk gown rustling aggressively. But instead of helping me up from the floor, she grabbed my arm and squeezed it hard, her manicured nails digging painfully into my bare skin. "Caroline, stop making a scene," she whispered fiercely, her fake smile plastered on tightly for the watching guests. "Go sit at the overflow table in the back corner near the kitchen doors. Do not embarrass your father on his big night." Stephanie and Terrence finally reached the table. Stephanie looked down at me, letting out a soft, mocking laugh that made my blood boil. "Honestly, Caroline, you should know better by now," she sneered, adjusting her massive diamond necklace. "Daddy wants the people who actually contribute to the family legacy sitting at the main table." Terrence chuckled, adjusting his expensive watch that probably cost more than my first car. "Yeah, let the real players sit where the money is," he added with a smug grin. I slowly pushed myself off the floor, my knees trembling with a toxic mix of shock and pure, unadulterated rage. I looked at my father, the man who had supposedly raised me and provided for me. "You are humiliating me over a chair, Thomas," I asked, my voice dangerously calm, despite the adrenaline coursing through my veins. "After I paid my own way through life while you funded her endless shopping sprees and his fake tech startups." My father stepped closer to me, his breath reeking of expensive scotch and arrogant entitlement. "You are just a bean counter, Caroline," he spat out, dismissing my entire career in one sentence. "You do not understand how real wealth works. Terrence here is a visionary. Stephanie is the future of my legacy. You are just an obligation I tolerated for 33 years. Now take your lawyer husband and go sit in the back with the lower-level management where you belong." I brushed the dust off my dress, taking a deep breath to steady myself. For 33 years, I had swallowed my pride. I had accepted the emotional abuse, the blatant favoritism, the endless gaslighting. I had told myself it was just how my family operated, and that I needed to be the bigger person. But hearing him call me an obligation, seeing my mother nod in agreement, and watching my sister revel in my public humiliation snapped the very last string of loyalty I had left inside my heart. I turned to David, ready to tell him we were leaving this toxic environment immediately. But David was not looking at me. He was staring directly at my father, and his eyes were cold, calculating, and entirely merciless. He stepped in front of me, shielding my body from my family, and prepared to drop a bomb that would shatter their perfect, wealthy world into a million irreversible pieces. David adjusted his tailored suit jacket with absolute precision. His movements were slow, deliberate, and completely devoid of the chaotic anger that fueled my father. He reached out and gently brushed an invisible speck of dust from my shoulder, a silent gesture of protection and solidarity. Then he turned his full attention back to my father. David did not raise his voice. He did not need to scream to command the room. As a top-tier corporate attorney, he possessed a vocal projection that dominated boardrooms and intimidated ruthless executives. The immaculate acoustics of the grand ballroom carried his words to every single guest sitting in the surrounding area. "The real daughter," David repeated. His tone was perfectly conversational, yet sharp enough to cut through solid steel. "And the visionary son-in-law." That is a truly fascinating choice of words, Thomas, especially considering the spectacular events that unfolded this morning. My father puffed out his chest, his face flushing an angry, dangerous purple. "Watch your tone with me, boy," he growled, pointing a thick finger at David. "You are standing in my club. You are drinking my expensive champagne. You are a guest at my table, and you are spending money that no longer belongs to you." David shot back instantly, his voice echoing with absolute authority. A collective gasp rippled through the nearest tables. The clinking of expensive silverware stopped completely. Even the professional waitstaff froze in their tracks, holding trays of caviar and champagne. The high society elite of our city practically held their breath, eager to witness the scandal unfolding before their eyes. Terrence scoffed, but his confident smile wavered for a fraction of a second. "Man, you do not know what you are talking about," he said, puffing up his chest in his custom suit. "I just closed a massive cryptocurrency syndicate deal. My digital portfolio is untouchable. You are just trying to ruin the vibe because your wife cannot handle being second best." David took one step closer to the VIP table, placing his hands flat on the pristine white tablecloth. He leaned forward, locking eyes directly with Terrence. "Your portfolio is a fragile house of cards built on wire fraud, offshore shell companies, and blatant lies," David stated. "And as of 8 o'clock this morning, it officially collapsed. You filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy in federal court, hoping to hide the devastating losses from your investors and your gullible father-in-law. But you forgot one crucial detail, Terrence. My law firm represents the primary creditors you defrauded. We have been tracking your fake empire for weeks." Terrence swallowed hard. The smug arrogance melted from his handsome face, replaced by a sudden ashen pallor. A bead of sweat formed on his forehead. He shifted his weight nervously, glancing toward the heavy wooden exit doors at the back of the ballroom. Stephanie slammed her manicured hand on the table, rattling the crystal water glasses. David, shut your mouth, she shrieked, her voice pitching into a hysterical whine. You are just jealous, because Terrence bought me a brand new Porsche yesterday while Caroline drives a sensible sedan. You are a pathetic liar making up stories to ruin my night. David did not even look at my sister. He kept his lethal predatory gaze fixed entirely on my father, who was now gripping the edge of the table with white knuckles. Thomas David said, his voice dropping to a dangerous register. You just shoved my wife to the floor to make room for a man who systematically drained your entire retirement fund to cover his catastrophic crypto margins. You gave him full power of attorney and access to your accounts last month because you thought he was a financial genius. You handed him the keys to your entire life savings. That is absurd, my mother, Brenda hissed, her voice trembling with rising panic. She grabbed my father by the arm, shaking it frantically. Thomas, tell him he is lying. Tell everyone this is just a jealous, bitter man trying to ruin your perfect retirement party. But Thomas could not speak. He stared at Terrence, waiting for a denial, a laugh, an explanation. He waited for his golden son-in-law to put David in his place. The denial never came. I highly suggest you check your phone, Terrence, David offered, stepping back and crossing his arms. Because exactly 20 minutes ago, the Securities and Exchange Commission executed an emergency freeze on all of your personal and business assets. They also froze every single account connected to your fraudulent enterprises. That includes the Apex Logistics Executive Retirement Fund. Your money is gone, Thomas, all of it. Every last cent you saved for this glorious retirement has vanished into the blockchain void. The silence in the ballroom was absolute and suffocating. You could hear a pin drop on the carpet. Then a sudden sharp buzzing sound broke the heavy tension. It was Terrence's phone vibrating aggressively on the table. The screen lit up with frantic notifications. Urgent alerts from his bank, desperate messages from his frantic lawyers, warning emails from his brokerage accounts. Terrence snatched the phone with violently shaking hands. He stared at the bright screen, his eyes widening in pure, unadulterated terror. He tapped the glass frantically, desperately refreshing his banking app, hoping for a different result. The digital balance displayed the brutal, inescapable reality. 0. Account frozen by federal mandate. Terrence. Stephanie asked, her voice shrinking into a frightened, confused whisper. Babe, tell them it is a mistake. Show them the bank accounts. Tell Daddy that his money is safe. Terrence looked at his wife, then at my father, whose face had turned a sickening, terrifying shade of gray. Terrence did not say a single word to comfort them. He shoved the phone deep into his pocket, knocked his heavy dining chair backward, and turned around. Without looking back at his weeping wife or his ruined father-in-law, he sprinted toward the grand double doors, pushing aggressively past the bewildered waitstaff and fleeing the country club like a coward. Terrence, wait for me! Stephanie screamed, scrambling awkwardly out of her chair. She tripped over the hem of her expensive designer gown, her expensive heels catching on the thick carpet as she chased blindly after her husband, leaving her devastated parents behind at the VIP table. The elite guests of the Oak Ridge Country Club immediately erupted into chaotic whispers. Cell phones were pulled out from evening bags. Wealthy investors were already texting their brokers and gossiping viciously about the legendary, spectacular downfall of Thomas. The perfect, flawless facade my mother had spent a lifetime cultivating was completely obliterated in a matter of seconds. My mother collapsed heavily into her chair, pressing trembling hands to her face. She sobbed uncontrollably, looking around the room and seeing the pity, the shock, and the undisguised mockery in the eyes of her wealthy friends. She had always prized her social status above her own daughter, and now she had to watch that status burn to the ground. My father stood frozen, staring blankly at the empty space where his visionary son-in-law had just been sitting. His chest heaved as he struggled to process the crushing magnitude of his financial and social ruin. The man who had prioritized his public image above his own flesh and blood now had absolutely nothing left but public humiliation and an empty bank account. As a forensic accountant, I had spent my entire career tracking stolen money and watching fraudsters face justice. But I had never witnessed a takedown quite as poetic and perfectly executed as the one my husband had just delivered. It was surgical precise and devastatingly effective. David turned away from the shattered remnants of my family and walked back to my side. He gently wrapped his strong arm around my waist, supporting me with genuine, unconditional love and respect. He looked at my father one last time, his expression completely devoid of sympathy. "Enjoy the retirement cake," Thomas David said, his voice dripping with icy satisfaction. "I hear the SEC serves excellent prison food." I held my head high, feeling a profound, overwhelming sense of liberation wash over me. For the first time in my 33 years of life, I did not feel like the family disappointment. I felt like the only winner in the room. David and I turned our backs on the chaos, the vicious whispers, and the broken pieces of my toxic family. We walked out of the grand ballroom together, our heads held high, leaving them to drown in the very mess they had so arrogantly created. The morning after the spectacular collapse of my father's retirement party, the quiet hum of my 30th floor corner office felt like an absolute sanctuary. As a senior forensic accountant, my workspace was a temple of logic. Floor-to-ceiling glass windows overlooked the bustling city, offering a sharp contrast to the chaotic, emotional wreckage I had left behind at the country club. I was sipping my black coffee and reviewing a complex ledger for a corporate client, when the heavy oak door to my office suddenly flew open, hitting the wall with a violent thud. My receptionist stood in the doorway looking entirely panicked, but she was quickly shoved aside by a frantic, disheveled woman. It was my mother, Brenda. She looked absolutely nothing like the polished, arrogant socialite who had demanded I sit at the overflow table just 12 hours prior. Her designer makeup was smeared under her eyes. Her hair was a tangled mess, and she was clutching a crumpled tissue in her trembling hands. She bypassed my receptionist and marched straight toward my desk, weaponizing her tears for maximum psychological manipulation. "Caroline, you have to fix this," my mother wailed, throwing herself into one of my leather guest chairs. She buried her face in her hands, sobbing loudly. "Thomas has been awake all night, clutching his chest. He is having heart palpitations. You are going to kill your father. You have to call David right now and tell him to drop this ridiculous investigation." I did not flinch. I did not offer her a tissue. I simply set my coffee mug down on a coaster and looked at her with the same detached, analytical gaze I used when interrogating embezzlers. "David does not control the Securities and Exchange Commission. Brenda," I said, my voice completely flat. "Nobody can just pick up a phone and call off a federal freeze on frozen assets. That is not how the law works, and that is certainly not how federal investigations operate." My mother dropped her hands from her face, revealing dry eyes entirely devoid of real tears. The weeping mother facade vanished instantly, replaced by the vicious, demanding woman I had known my entire life. She slammed her hand flat against my glass desk. "Do not play stupid with me, Caroline," she hissed, her voice dripping with pure venom. "You know exactly what you are doing. You are just jealous. You have always been insanely jealous of your sister. You convinced your husband to dig into Terrence because you could not stand seeing Stephanie happy and wealthy. You are trying to destroy her marriage out of pure spite." I leaned back in my ergonomic chair, steepled my fingers, and let out a short, humorless laugh. "Jealous," I repeated, letting the word hang in the quiet office. "You think I am jealous of a woman whose husband just flushed her entire future down a digital toilet? Let us get one thing perfectly straight, Brenda. I did not ask David to investigate Terrence. David triggered the legal avalanche based on the forensic audit that I conducted myself. I am the one who tracked the missing money. I am the one who found the offshore accounts. I am the one who handed the federal authorities the exact coordinates of every single dime Terrence stole from you and Thomas." My mother stared at me, her mouth opening and closing like a suffocated fish. The color completely drained from her face as the reality of my words set in. I was not just the lawyer wife standing in the shadows. I was the architect of their downfall. "You did this," she whispered, her voice shaking with genuine horror this time. "You ruined your own family over a petty childhood grudge." "A petty grudge?" I asked, my tone dropping to a dangerous, icy whisper. "Let us talk about family support, Brenda. When I got accepted into my master's program, you and Thomas told me that paying for my tuition was a bad return on investment. You forced me to take out $80,000 in high-interest student loans. I worked 2 jobs, waiting tables until midnight and studying until dawn just to keep a roof over my head. You told me that I needed to learn the harsh value of a dollar. I stood up from my desk, planting my hands on the glass surface and leaning closer to her. And do you know what you did exactly? 1 week later, I continued, never breaking eye contact. You and Thomas bought Stephanie a brand new luxury SUV wrapped in a giant red bow simply because she managed to graduate with a C average in a basic communications degree. You handed her the keys to a $90,000 vehicle while I was eating instant noodles to afford my textbooks. You told me I was an obligation while you treated her like royalty. Well, I learned the value of a dollar just like you wanted. I learned how to trace them, how to audit them, and how to find exactly where rats like Terrence hide them. My mother stood up violently, knocking the heavy leather chair backward. Her face was twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated hatred. You are a monster, she spat, pointing a shaking finger at my face. You are no daughter of mine. You are a cold, calculating bitch, and you are going to burn in hell for what you have done to this family. I am just returning the exact same energy you invested in me, I replied calmly, reaching over to my desk phone. I pressed the intercom button connecting directly to the front lobby. Security. Please come to the 30th floor corner office. I have a trespasser who needs to be escorted out of the building immediately. My mother gasped, taking a step back, as if I had physically struck her. You are calling security on your own mother, she shrieked, her voice echoing off the glass walls. You cannot do this to me. I just did, I stated, walking around my desk and pointing toward the heavy oak door. Your golden child is probably crying in a foreclosed mansion right now. I suggest you go comfort her because your fake tears hold absolutely zero currency in my office. 2 broad-shouldered security guards appeared in the doorway seconds later looking strictly professional. You need to leave the premises immediately, one of the guards said, stepping toward my mother and gesturing toward the hallway. Brenda grabbed her designer purse, her chest heaving with furious, indignant rage. She glared at me, her eyes promising brutal retaliation. You will pay for this, Caroline, she screamed, as the guards firmly guided her by the arms out into the corridor. You and your smug husband are going to pay for tearing this family apart. I stood in the doorway of my office, watching them drag her kicking and screaming toward the glass elevators. The entire floor of accountants and analysts watched the spectacle in stunned silence. I simply turned around, walked back into my office, and closed the heavy oak door, shutting out the noise. I sat back down at my desk, picked up my black coffee, and reopened my client ledger. I knew my mother and my sister would not go down without a dirty fight, but I was ready for whatever pathetic retaliation they had planned. The rest of the workday passed with a strange quietness. I finalized the corporate audits, leaving the office long after the sun dipped below the city skyline. Driving my sleek sedan back to our upscale gated community, I let the silence of the car wash over me. I had expected a barrage of angry text messages from Stephanie, or perhaps another threatening voicemail from Thomas. Instead, my phone remained completely silent. That should have been my first warning. Toxic people do not retreat gracefully. They simply regroup to strike where you least expect it. They gather their wounded pride and look for the most painful way to exact their petty revenge. I pulled into the pristine driveway of our modern architectural home. The motion sensor lights flicked on, illuminating the manicured landscaping and the massive oak doors of our entrance. Everything looked perfectly normal until I stepped out of the car. My heels crunched on something hard and sharp, scattered across the paved walkway. I looked down and saw jagged pieces of shattered tempered glass sparkling under the bright security lights. My heart rate spiked instantly. I dropped my leather briefcase and ran toward the front entrance. The massive custom glass door leading into our formal living room had been completely smashed in. The heavy frame hung off its hinges, battered by a blunt, heavy instrument. I stepped carefully through the wreckage. The cold evening air was blowing through the gaping hole in my sanctuary. The violation of my private space felt heavy and suffocating. I reached for the light switch on the wall. The moment the bright recessed lighting flooded the room, the breath was violently knocked out of my lungs. There, on my immaculate white gallery wall, was a massive, jagged message sprayed in dripping neon red paint. It read, "Family Traitor," in enormous letters. The toxic fumes of aerosol paint still hung heavily in the air, mixing with the metallic scent of broken glass and cold wind. They had not just breached my home, they had violated my safe space. The psychological warfare had officially escalated into unhinged physical terror. They wanted me to feel vulnerable. They wanted me to know that their petty rage could reach me even behind locked doors. They wanted to prove that they could touch me no matter how much money I made or how far I distanced myself from their toxic grasp. I stood in the center of the ruined living room, my fists clenched so tightly my nails dug into my palms. I did not cry. I did not scream. I pulled out my phone and dialed my husband. David answered on the first ring. His voice was smooth and calm, indicating he was still at his downtown law firm wrapping up a corporate brief. "David," I said, my voice dropping to a low, steady register. "You need to come home immediately. Do not ask questions. Just get here as fast as you can." It took David exactly 18 minutes to pull his sports car into the driveway. I heard the tires screech against the pavement before his heavy footsteps rushed toward the shattered entryway. When he stepped through the broken frame, his eyes swept over the absolute destruction. He looked at the shattered glass covering our expensive Persian rugs, and then his gaze locked onto the glowing red letters defacing our wall. David did not panic. He did not ask if I was okay because he could see the cold, calculated fury radiating from my posture. Instead, his handsome face hardened into a mask of absolute lethal focus. He unbuttoned his tailored suit jacket, removed his silk tie, and tossed them onto an unharmed armchair. He pulled out his phone, dialing a number with rapid precision. "Send a patrol unit to my residence immediately," he commanded into the receiver, his tone leaving zero room for debate. "We have a felony breaking and entering with extensive property damage. Yes, I will hold for the dispatcher." He lowered the phone slightly, looking at me from across the ruined room. "Brenda or Stephanie?" he asked, his voice completely devoid of any emotion. "Brenda promised I would pay for humiliating her in my office today," I replied, staring at the dripping red paint. "And Stephanie has the emotional maturity of a spoiled toddler throwing a massive tantrum because her credit cards are frozen. Take your pick." Either way, they just handed us a golden ticket. David ended the call with the police dispatcher and immediately dialed another number. This time it was his private security contractor. "I need a full tactical sweep of my property," he ordered, pacing across the ruined floor. "I want high-definition motion tracking cameras installed at every possible entry point. I want reinforced security glass ordered tonight, and I want an armed detail parked at the end of my driveway until the new perimeter is completely secure. I am paying double your premium emergency rate, so get your best team here in 20 minutes." He ended the call and walked over to me. He gently brushed a stray piece of glass away from my shoulder, his touch a stark contrast to the violence surrounding us. "They think this scares us, Caroline," he said, his eyes dark and promising absolute ruin. "They think throwing a rock through a window and ruining a wall makes them powerful. But they just crossed the line from a petty family dispute into criminal trespassing and felony vandalism." The distant wail of police sirens began to echo through our quiet neighborhood, growing louder by the second. I looked up at the red letters defacing our wall and let out a sharp, humorless laugh. "They really are remarkably stupid," I said, shaking my head. "They spent 33 years calling me a disappointment, but they forgot what I actually do for a living. I build airtight federal cases out of tiny fractured pieces of evidence." David smiled, a chilling, predatory expression that would make any opposing corporate counsel sweat. "The police are here to file the property damage report," he said, stepping toward the front door to greet the flashing blue and red lights. "But tomorrow morning, we are filing a restraining order against your mother and your sister. And then we are going to use this police report to subpoena their cellular location data to prove exactly who held that spray can. I watched the uniformed police officers step carefully through our shattered front door, their flashlights illuminating the wreckage. Brenda and Stephanie wanted to play dirty. They wanted to terrorize me into submission. But they had just handed a forensic accountant and a corporate attorney the exact criminal evidence needed to destroy them without a single ounce of mercy. The morning sunlight streamed through the newly installed reinforced security glass of my entryway, casting long, sharp shadows across the immaculate hardwood floor. I was standing in the kitchen, pouring a fresh cup of espresso, enjoying the absolute tranquility of my Saturday morning. The heavy, suffocating drama of my toxic family seemed miles away, completely neutralized by the solid boundaries and high-tech security perimeter my husband had established. But peace is a fragile illusion when dealing with desperate people who have just lost everything. The sudden violent pounding against the front door shattered the quiet echoing through the house like a physical blow. The impact was so aggressive that the thick, reinforced glass shuddered in its steel frame. I did not jump, I did not drop my coffee. I simply placed my mug on the granite counter and walked purposefully toward the security control panel mounted on the hallway wall. The high-definition surveillance monitors displayed a chaotic, pathetic scene unfolding on my front porch. It was my younger sister Stephanie and her fraudulent husband Terrence. The flawless, wealthy facade they had paraded around the country club just a few nights ago had entirely melted away, leaving behind the raw, ugly desperation of cornered animals. Stephanie was pacing wildly, her designer trench coat wrinkled and hastily buttoned over what looked like luxury pajamas. Her hair was unbrushed, and her face was streaked with yesterday expensive makeup. Terrence looked even worse. The self-proclaimed visionary entrepreneur was sweating profusely, his custom-tailored suit jacket missing and his silk shirt untucked. He was hammering his heavy fists against the shatterproof glass, his face contorted in a mask of unhinged rage. I pressed the silver button on the intercom panel, allowing my voice to project through the exterior speakers with crisp authority. "Can I help you two find directions to the nearest bankruptcy attorney?" I asked, my tone completely devoid of emotion. Stephanie froze her head, snapping toward the camera lens. Her eyes were wide and bloodshot, burning with a furious, frantic energy. "Open this door right now, Caroline," she shrieked, her voice pitching into a hysterical wail that the thick glass mercifully muffled. "You have ruined my entire life. You destroyed our family company and you are going to stand there and fix it. Open the door." I unlocked the deadbolts with a heavy, satisfying click and slowly pulled the massive door open, stepping out onto the porch. I crossed my arms and stood my ground, the cool morning air washing over me. I had an armed security detail parked discreetly at the end of my street, and high-resolution cameras recording every single movement and word. I was legally and physically untouchable, and I wanted them to feel the crushing weight of that reality. "I did not ruin your life, Stephanie," I replied, my voice dropping to a dangerous, icy calm. "Your husband ruined your life the exact second he decided to use the executive retirement fund of our father as his personal offshore piggy bank." I simply turned on the lights so the federal authorities could see the roaches scurrying across the floor. Terrence shoved violently past my sister, closing the physical distance between us in 2 aggressive strides. He loomed over me, attempting to use his height and broad shoulders to physically intimidate me into submission. The polished, sophisticated businessman act was completely gone, replaced by the crude, thuggish desperation of a con artist whose massive Ponzi scheme had just imploded. "You listen to me very carefully, you arrogant little bean counter," he growled, jabbing a shaking finger mere inches from my face. "You are going to walk back into your fancy office. You are going to log into whatever federal portal you used to submit that report. You are going to contact the Securities and Exchange Commission, and you are going to retract that fraudulent audit immediately. You will tell them you made a massive accounting error, and you will drop this entire investigation today." I looked at his trembling finger and let out a cold, dismissive laugh that made his jaw clench in fury. You clearly have absolutely zero understanding of how federal financial regulations work, Terrence, I stated, leaning forward instead of backing away. You cannot simply pick up a phone and hit the undo button on a multi-million-dollar federal wire fraud investigation. The forensic audit I submitted to the authorities contained over 50 pages of irrefutable digital evidence. I handed the government your bank routing numbers, your encrypted transaction logs, and the exact coordinates of the Cayman Island shell accounts you used to funnel the stolen logistics revenue. The money trail is carved in digital stone, and your pathetic threats cannot erase mathematics. Stephanie grabbed Terrence by the arm, pulling him back slightly, her face pale with pure terror. "Tell them it was a misunderstanding," she pleaded, stepping toward me with desperate tear-filled eyes. "Tell them Daddy authorized those financial transfers. If you do not call off the investigation, Terrence is going to go to federal prison. They are threatening to seize my sports cars and my diamond jewelry, Caroline. You are my flesh and blood sister. You cannot do this to me. You have to save my husband." I looked at my sister, marveling at the sheer staggering depth of her narcissistic delusion. "You genuinely believe this is about your jewelry, Stephanie?" I asked, shaking my head in absolute disbelief. "You spent your entire life treating me like absolute garbage because Thomas and Brenda convinced you that you were the center of the universe. You stood by and laughed while they humiliated me. You watched them hand you everything on a silver platter, while I fought tooth and nail for basic respect. And now that your fraudulent husband has finally burned your precious golden kingdom to the ground, you expect me to risk my professional license and commit federal perjury to save your designer handbags." Terrence completely lost what little sanity he had left. He lunged forward aggressively, grabbing the collar of my silk blouse with a violent yank. His eyes were wide and erratic, a dangerous mixture of panic and rage. "You are going to fix this!" he roared, spit flying from his mouth as he tightened his grip. "I am not going down for this. I will burn your entire life to ashes before I let you put me in a federal cage. You will call the authorities, or I swear to God I will make sure you never breathe a word of this again." I did not scream. I did not struggle against his grip. I simply stared into his panicked eyes, completely unfazed by his pathetic attempt at physical violence. I knew exactly what was about to happen next. I knew that laying a hand on me on my own property in front of high-definition security cameras was the absolute worst and final mistake Terrence would ever make in his miserable life. The heavy, rapid footsteps thundering down the hallway behind me confirmed my exact thoughts. A heavy hand clamped down onto Terrence's wrist with the crushing force of a steel vise. The grip was so sudden and violently precise that Terrence immediately gasped, releasing his hold on my silk blouse. He stumbled backward, his expensive leather shoes slipping awkwardly on the pristine porch. I did not even flinch. I simply smoothed the wrinkled collar of my shirt and watched as my husband stepped squarely between me and the man who had just assaulted me. David did not raise his fists. He did not yell or strike Terrence, even though the raw fury radiating from his rigid posture suggested he could easily break the man in half. David was a top-tier corporate attorney, and he fought his battles using weapons far more destructive than physical violence. He adjusted his custom-tailored suit jacket, his eyes locking onto Terrence with a cold, predatory calmness that was absolutely terrifying to witness. "Take exactly one step back from my wife," David instructed, his voice dropping to a lethal quiet register that echoed perfectly in the crisp morning air. "If you ever dare to lay a single finger on her again, I will not just ensure you rot in federal prison. I will make sure the prosecuting attorneys bury you so deeply under civil litigation that your great-grandchildren will be paying off your legal fees." Terrence puffed up his chest, attempting to mask his visible terror with a pathetic display of bravado. "You cannot talk to me like that," he sneered, wiping the heavy sweat from his forehead. "I am an entrepreneur. I have legal rights. You and your wife are fabricating fake audits to steal my company." David let out a sharp, humorless laugh that cut through the tension like a razor. "Your company?" he echoed, shaking his head in sheer disbelief. "Let us talk about your company, Terrence. Let us talk about Zenith Digital Innovations." Specifically, let us talk about the offshore shell corporation you registered in the Cayman Islands under the routing number ending in 4729. Terrence froze completely. All the aggressive posturing vanished from his body in an instant. The color drained from his face, leaving him looking physically sick. Stephanie, who had been standing behind him clutching her designer coat, stopped her frantic pacing. She looked at David, her bloodshot eyes widening in confusion. I know exactly how you structured the wire fraud. David continued, stepping closer to Terrence and dominating the physical space. You used a cryptocurrency tumbling service to obscure the funds you siphoned from the Apex Logistics Executive Retirement Account. You disguised the stolen capital as digital asset acquisitions. Then you routed exactly $4.5 million through 3 separate dummy corporations before depositing the cash into the Cayman account. Title 18, United States Code Section 1343, Wire Fraud. That carries a penalty of up to 20 years in federal prison per count, Terrence. And I personally documented 17 separate illegal transfers. Terrence was visibly trembling now, his breath coming in shallow, frantic gasps. He looked wildly around the property as if searching for an escape route that simply did not exist. David was mathematically and legally eviscerating him right on my front porch, and there was absolutely no defense against the cold, hard facts. David was not finished. He turned his piercing gaze toward my sister, who was shaking her head in violent denial. "And you, Stephanie," David said, his tone lacking even a single ounce of pity. "You stand here demanding that Caroline save your luxurious lifestyle and your fake diamond jewelry. You blindly defend a man who has not only defrauded your father, but is actively stealing from you." "What are you talking about?" Stephanie demanded, her voice cracking with rising panic. She grabbed Terrence by the arm. "Tell him to stop lying, Terrence. Tell him he is making this up. Check your exclusive American Express Black Card statement." Stephanie, David instructed, his words striking like physical blows. "The card you assumed was paying for secure server hosting for his tech startup. Take a very close look at the $200,000 transaction executed last Tuesday afternoon. Terrence did not buy servers. He authorized a massive wire transfer for a down payment on a luxury oceanfront property in Boca Raton." Stephanie gasped, stepping away from her husband as if she had been burned. Terrence reached out for her, but she violently slapped his hand away. "The deed is not in your name, Stephanie," David stated mercilessly, finalizing the absolute destruction of her perfect fake marriage. "The property is legally registered to a 24-year-old fitness model named Jasmine Carter. Did Terrence tell you he was flying to Miami for a blockchain summit last week? He lied. He was picking out imported Italian marble countertops with his mistress using the exact credit line you guarantee with your signature." The psychological break in my sister was immediate and devastating to witness. The sheer cognitive dissonance of realizing her golden life, her perfect marriage, and her limitless wealth were all a complete fabricated illusion was simply too much for her fragile, narcissistic mind to process. Instead of confronting the lying, fraudulent criminal standing right next to her, Stephanie reverted to her oldest and most reliable coping mechanism. She targeted the family scapegoat. She lunged past David, her face contorted with unhinged manic rage. "You set this up!" Stephanie screamed, spittle flying from her lips as she aimed all of her fury directly at me. "You forged those bank records. You hired someone to fake that property deed. You have always been insanely jealous of me, and now you are trying to destroy my marriage with your disgusting lies." Before David could intercept her, Stephanie swung her arm wildly and slapped me hard across the left side of my face. The sharp, stinging crack echoed loudly across the porch. My head snapped to the side from the sheer force of the impact. David moved instantly, stepping between us and gripping Stephanie by the wrist, pushing her back with stern, unyielding authority. I did not fall. I did not cry. I slowly turned my face back to look at my sister, tasting a faint trace of copper in my mouth. I smiled, a cold, empty expression that made her step backward in sudden fear. "That is felony assault, Stephanie," I said, my voice dangerously calm. "And it is the very last time you will ever lay a hand on me for the rest of your miserable life." Right on cue, the synchronized wail of heavy sirens pierced the quiet morning air. A fleet of vehicles turned aggressively onto our private street. Red and blue emergency lights flashed brilliantly against the shattered glass and ruined facade of my home. Two unmarked black SUVs and three local police cruisers pulled up directly to the curb, blocking the driveway entirely. My armed security detail stepped aside, lowering their weapons as several federal agents wearing tactical jackets stepped out of the vehicles alongside uniformed police officers. They marched briskly up the walkway, their expressions strictly business. Terrence let out a pathetic whimpering sound, taking a desperate step backward until his spine hit the brick column of my house. There was nowhere left to run. The fake empire had officially collapsed and the bill had finally come due. Terrence Miller, one of the leading federal agents, announced, pulling a set of heavy steel handcuffs from his tactical belt. "We have a federal warrant for your arrest on multiple charges of wire fraud, money laundering, and criminal conspiracy. Turn around and place your hands behind your back immediately." At the exact moment the federal agents shoved Terrence into the back of their black SUV, his expensive Italian leather shoes scraping against the pavement, the heavy doors slammed shut with a definitive metallic clank, sealing his fate. Stephanie did not run after the vehicle. She did not pull out her phone to call a high-powered defense attorney. She did not even ask the lead federal agent where they were taking the father of her future children. Instead, as the convoy of flashing red and blue lights disappeared down our tree-lined street, my sister did what any cornered narcissist does when their fake reality shatters. She reached into her designer trench coat, pulled out her smartphone, and immediately opened her social media platforms. Within 2 hours of her husband being hauled away in handcuffs, Stephanie initiated a live broadcast that would go down in our family history as the most unhinged digital performance of the decade. David and I sat in our kitchen watching the catastrophe unfold on my tablet. We had instructed our armed security detail to escort her off our property earlier, so she was broadcasting straight from the grand foyer of our parents' foreclosed mansion. The production value of her victimhood was truly staggering. Stephanie had clearly spent those 2 hours intentionally smearing her expensive mascara to look sufficiently traumatized. The lighting in the hallway cast long, dramatic shadows across her pale face. She stared into the camera lens with wide, tear-filled eyes, her bottom lip quivering in a perfectly calculated display of sheer desperation. "My name is Stephanie, and my family is currently under a malicious, targeted attack," she began, her voice cracking with practiced, theatrical grief. "I am coming to you live because the truth needs to be heard before the media twists this story. My own sister Caroline and her ruthless corporate lawyer husband have orchestrated a massive illegal conspiracy to steal our family logistics company. They just sent federal agents to my house to arrest my husband Terrence on completely fabricated charges." David took a slow sip of his espresso, watching my sister completely perjure herself in real time. "She is really doubling down on the innocent wife routine," he noted, his tone thoroughly amused. "I suppose admitting your husband bought a beachfront property for his 24-year-old mistress using your platinum credit card does not generate the same level of internet sympathy." Stephanie continued her broadcast, wiping away a single strategic tear. "Caroline has always been insanely jealous of me. She has hated me since we were children because our parents loved me and supported my dreams. She is a bitter, ungrateful woman who could never succeed on her own merits. So she married a shark attorney, and they forged financial documents to frame Terrence. They hacked into his crypto accounts, planted fake evidence, and tipped off the authorities just to ruin my marriage and seize control of my father's hard-earned legacy." The digital engagement on her video skyrocketed. Within minutes, thousands of people were watching the live stream. The comment section scrolled past at a dizzying speed, filled with gullible internet strangers, offering their blind support to the weeping wealthy socialite. They called me a monster. They labeled David a corrupt legal predator. They demanded justice for Terrence, spinning the narrative into a tragic tale of an innocent minority entrepreneur being targeted by a vicious corporate conspiracy. But the absolute worst part was not the strangers on the internet. It was the immediate vicious reaction from our extended family. My phone began vibrating aggressively against the granite countertop. The family group chat, which I had muted years ago, suddenly exploded with toxic vitriol. My aunt sent a massive paragraph accusing me of tearing the family apart out of pure spite. My cousins, who had spent the last decade comfortably leeching off my father's wealth, flooded my inbox with vile, threatening messages. They called me a backstabbing snake. They said I was a disgrace to our bloodline. They demanded I drop the fake charges immediately, or they would personally ensure I was excommunicated and publicly ruined. They fully believed Stephanie and her delusional narrative because acknowledging the truth meant acknowledging that the family bank account was permanently empty. "Look at this," Stephanie cried into the camera, holding up a framed photograph of our parents. "My father is a good, honest man who built an empire from nothing. He gave Caroline everything she ever wanted, and this is how she repays him. She is trying to send an innocent man to federal prison and throw her own parents out onto the street. Please share this video. Please help me expose Caroline for the treacherous sociopath she truly is." I watched the viewer count cross the 50,000 mark. The sheer volume of hatred directed at me was staggering. Any normal person might have cracked under the immense weight of a public smear campaign. They might have issued a frantic public statement or locked their social media accounts in terror. I simply picked up my phone and disabled all incoming notifications with one tap of my finger. "Are you quite all right?" David asked, observing my completely calm demeanor. He reached across the kitchen island, resting his hand over mine. "The public defamation is actionable, Caroline. We can bury her under a civil suit for slander before the sun sets." I shook my head, offering my husband a cold, sharp smile. "I am perfectly fine, David. In fact, I have never felt better." Stephanie just broadcast her entire defamatory narrative to a massive public audience. She just accused a licensed corporate attorney of fabricating federal evidence, and she just claimed a forensic accountant forged audited financial records. She gave us the rope, and now she is tying it securely around her own neck. I slid the tablet away, closing the live video right as Stephanie began begging her followers to donate to a legal defense fund she had just set up for Terrence. She was crowdsourcing her delusion, relying on the kindness of strangers to fund a criminal defense for a man who had already drained millions. "We are not going to argue with a crying woman on the internet, David," I stated, standing up from the kitchen stool. "We are going to respond the only way professionals do. We are going to hit them with a mountain of irrefutable paper. I need you to draft the most aggressive cease and desist order your firm has ever produced. And while you do that, I am going to the secure storage facility downtown to pull the original historical incorporation documents for Apex Logistics. If Stephanie wants to talk to the world about who truly owns our father's legacy, then it is finally time we show everyone exactly who built this empire." David hit the send button on his laptop with a sharp, definitive click. We did not just mail a standard cease and desist letter. That would be entirely too polite for the sheer magnitude of slander my sister had just broadcasted to the digital world. Instead, David utilized his firm legal server to blast a comprehensive litigation hold and defamation warning to every single member of our extended family. He did not stop there. He copied the board of directors at Apex Logistics, the country club management, and every major socialite who had commented on Stephanie live video. Attached to this aggressive legal warning was a neatly organized digital portfolio containing the absolute undeniable truth. It included the federal Chapter 11 bankruptcy filing Terrence submitted yesterday morning. It contained the exact court order from the Securities and Exchange Commission freezing the accounts. And as the ultimate killing blow, David attached the redacted American Express statement showing the $200,000 down payment Terrence made for his 24-year-old mistress. The effect was instantaneous and completely devastating. My phone, which had been vibrating off the granite counter with toxic abuse from my extended relatives, suddenly went dead silent. My cousin Bradley, who had just sent me a massive paragraph threatening to ruin my career, attempted to unsend his message. The furious typing in the family group chat ceased completely. You cannot argue with federal court documents, and you certainly cannot maintain a wealthy victim narrative when a top-tier corporate attorney provides receipts of your husband buying a beachfront condo for another woman. Stephanie deleted her live video exactly 4 minutes after David sent the email. But the internet is forever, and the damage to her flawless socialite reputation was permanently sealed. While David managed the legal fallout, I grabbed my keys and drove my sedan to the highly secured underground storage facility in the financial district. This was where the oldest physical records of Apex Logistics were kept far away from the digitized corporate servers. My father Thomas had always aggressively guarded these archives. He claimed it was standard protocol to protect his proprietary business strategies from corporate espionage. As a senior forensic accountant, I knew better. When a CEO hides paper files from 30 years ago, they are not protecting business secrets. They are hiding the original sin of their entire empire. The air in the climate-controlled storage unit was stale and smelled of aging paper and metallic dust. I bypassed the recent fiscal year cabinets and walked straight to the back of the concrete room. I found a stack of heavy cardboard banker boxes labeled with the incorporation dates from the early 90s. Thomas had built his entire identity around the narrative of being a self-made man. He constantly bragged at expensive charity dinners about how he built Apex Logistics from a single delivery truck into a multi-million-dollar supply chain titan. He used that fake origin story to demand absolute loyalty and obedience from everyone in our family. I hauled a heavy box onto the metal viewing table and snapped the lid off. I sifted through dozens of yellowing tax returns and outdated vendor contracts. My manicured fingers flipped past irrelevant ledgers until I hit a thick manila folder buried at the very bottom. The label simply read, Original Operating Agreement and Share Issuance. I opened the folder, spreading the crisp, aged documents out under the harsh fluorescent lights of the storage room. I scanned the first page, tracing the legal jargon regarding the initial capitalization of the corporation. My eyes jumped to the bottom of the page, searching for my father's signature on the founder line. Thomas did not sign the document. His name was nowhere near the primary shareholder designation. My breath caught in my throat. I leaned closer, staring at the bold black ink signature of the majority stakeholder who had invested the foundational millions to launch the company. I recognized the name immediately. It was a name Brenda had aggressively tried to erase from my memory since I was a little girl. It was the name printed on my original birth certificate before Thomas formally adopted me. The founder of Apex Logistics was my biological father. I scrambled to pull out the next stack of papers in the folder. My heart pounded against my ribs with the heavy, rhythmic thud of a massive, undeniable revelation. I found a highly irregular share transfer agreement dated exactly 3 weeks after my biological father died in a tragic aviation accident. The document outlined the transfer of his 90% ownership stake directly into a custodial trust. That trust was specifically designated for my care, my education, and my future inheritance. I kept reading the dense legal text, my forensic accounting training taking over my emotional shock. I traced the money trail through the faded typewritten pages. The structure of the transfer was a masterpiece of corporate theft. Thomas had swooped in and assumed the role of the trust executor. Because my mother Brenda had quickly married him, he gained total legal control over the corporate voting rights. He then systematically diluted the shares belonging to the trust, issuing new equity to himself until he was the undisputed majority owner. He did not build Apex Logistics from the ground up. He hijacked a fully operational, highly profitable enterprise from a dead man, and he used the corporate profits generated by my biological father to fund his own arrogant lifestyle. The realization hit me with the devastating force of a freight train. Every single luxury car Thomas bought for Stephanie was paid for by my stolen inheritance. The country club memberships, the designer wardrobes, the sprawling mansion where I was treated like a second-class citizen. All of it was financed by the very trust fund Thomas had legally plundered from me. He had spent 33 years calling me an obligation. He had shoved me to the floor and told me I was not his real daughter, while he was literally standing on an empire built by my real father. I carefully photographed every single page of the documents with my encrypted phone, ensuring the flash captured the notary stamps and dates perfectly. I placed the fragile papers back into the manila folder and returned the box to its exact position on the shelf. I did not cry. I did not feel an ounce of grief or sadness for the childhood that was stolen from me. I felt the cold, calculated thrill of a predator who had just found the exposed jugular of their prey. Thomas thought he was a genius for hiding his massive corporate theft in a dusty basement archive, but he made the fatal mistake of raising a forensic accountant and pushing her entirely past the point of no return. He had stolen my legacy to build a golden throne for his spoiled daughter. Now I had the exact weapon I needed to repossess my empire and leave him with absolutely nothing. The conference room at my husband's law firm was designed to intimidate opposing counsel. It was a massive space wrapped in floor-to-ceiling glass, offering a panoramic view of the financial district. The long table was carved from a single slab of black walnut, polished to a mirror finish. David and I sat on one side perfectly composed while we waited for the elevator doors down the hall to open. We had summoned Thomas and Brenda, using a formal legal courier, ensuring they understood this was not a family mediation. This was a corporate execution. When my mother and the man I had called my father for 3 decades finally stepped into the room, they looked like hollow shells of the arrogant socialites who had humiliated me at the country club. The federal arrest of their golden son-in-law had completely shattered their public image. Brenda wore a pair of oversized designer sunglasses indoors, desperately trying to hide her swollen eyes. Thomas walked with a rigid, tense posture, his jaw clenched so tightly the muscles in his face twitched. He pulled out a chair for Brenda and sat down across from us, crossing his arms in a pathetic display of defiance. "You have exactly 10 minutes, Caroline." Thomas growled, his voice rough and exhausted. "We are dealing with an absolute nightmare right now. Stephanie is hyperventilating in a hotel room because federal agents are seizing her assets and the press is parked outside my driveway. Tell your husband to call off his legal attack dog so we can handle this quietly as a family." I did not speak right away. I simply reached into my leather briefcase and pulled out the thick manila folder I had retrieved from the underground storage facility. I placed it squarely in the center of the black walnut table. I slid it forward until it rested exactly halfway between us. "I suggest you open that, Thomas," I said, my voice dead calm, "because the nightmare you are dealing with right now is nothing compared to the one I am about to unleash on you." Thomas stared at the folder. A brief flash of recognition crossed his eyes, followed instantly by a shadow of genuine panic. His arrogant posture faltered for a fraction of a second. Brenda reached out with a trembling hand and flipped the folder open. She looked down at the 30-year-old incorporation documents and the original trust fund agreement. The color drained entirely from her face, leaving her looking physically ill. She dropped the papers as if they were actively on fire and pressed her hands over her mouth. "You went into the company archives," Thomas stated, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous growl. "You had absolutely no authorization to access those restricted corporate files. I am a senior forensic accountant investigating a federal wire fraud case," I replied, resting my hands on the table. "The authorities grant a wide latitude when tracking stolen money. But we are not here to discuss Terrence today. We are here to discuss my biological father. We are here to discuss how you hijacked a highly profitable logistics enterprise from a dead man and systematically looted my private trust fund to finance your lavish lifestyle." I expected Thomas to deny it. I expected him to spin a complex web of corporate lies or blame the attorneys who drafted the paperwork. Instead, Thomas leaned back in his heavy leather chair and let out a cold, bitter laugh. He looked at me with a level of pure, unadulterated hatred that finally explained my entire miserable childhood. "You think you uncovered some massive, brilliant conspiracy," he mocked, shaking his head. "You think you are a genius for finding a few old contracts. Let me tell you exactly what those papers mean, Caroline. They mean your mother was a filthy cheat." Brenda squeezed her eyes shut, letting out a pathetic whimper, but Thomas ignored her entirely. "Your biological father was my business partner." Thomas continued, his voice dripping with venom. We built the foundation of that logistics company together. But he was not just my partner. He was the man your mother decided to sleep with behind my back. She betrayed me. She humiliated me. And when he died in that aviation accident, she came crawling back to me begging for forgiveness because she was pregnant with his bastard child. She was pregnant with you. The sheer toxicity of the revelation hung heavily in the sterile air of the conference room. I looked at Brenda, who refused to meet my gaze. She had spent 33 years acting like a victim, allowing Thomas to emotionally abuse me because she was too cowardly to face the consequences of her own infidelity. I took you in, Thomas spat, leaning forward and slamming his hand on the table. I gave you my last name to save this family from public disgrace. I kept the secret to protect my reputation. But you look exactly like him, Caroline. Every single day for 33 years, I had to look at your face and see the man who slept with my wife. You were a walking, breathing reminder of my ultimate humiliation. David shifted slightly in his chair, his eyes locking onto Thomas with lethal intensity. So you decided to steal her inheritance as compensation, David stated, his voice dangerously quiet. You committed corporate theft and fiduciary fraud to punish a child for the sins of her parents. It was not theft, Thomas shot back, his pride overriding any sense of legal danger. It was a tax. It was the price she owed me for keeping a roof over her head. Her father left a massive trust fund and 90% of a lucrative company. You really think I was going to let the bastard child of a traitor inherit an empire while my own biological daughter got nothing? Absolutely not. Thomas pointed a shaking finger at me, his face twisted into a mask of pure malicious triumph. I drained every single cent of that trust fund, Thomas confessed proudly. I used your money to buy Stephanie her first car. I used your money to pay for her private schools, her luxury vacations, and her designer clothes. I diluted your corporate shares and transferred them to myself so I could build the life my real daughter deserved. You paid for everything Stephanie has. You funded the entire golden life of the sister you despise so much. And I do not regret a single second of it. I took what was rightfully mine for enduring the miserable burden of raising you. He sat back, crossing his arms with a smug, satisfied grin. He actually believed he was the victim. He genuinely thought that his wounded ego justified decades of financial exploitation and psychological abuse. I looked at the man who had spent my entire life demanding my respect while secretly robbing me blind. I did not feel hurt. I did not feel the crushing weight of betrayal. The knowledge that I was not biologically related to this toxic monster was the greatest gift he could have ever given me. I picked up my pen and tapped it gently against the polished wood of the table. That is a fascinating confession, Thomas, I said, offering him a cold, razor-sharp smile. You just admitted to fiduciary fraud, embezzlement, and the misappropriation of a minor trust fund. And you did it sitting inside the conference room of a top-tier corporate law firm while my husband took detailed notes. I watched the color drain from Brenda's face. She had spent my entire life playing the victim, but there was no hiding behind her tears anymore. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the polished black walnut table. You actually believe your wounded ego justifies stealing from a child? I said, my voice echoing in the massive glass room. You stole my father's legacy to fund Stephanie's designer handbags. You committed fiduciary fraud and embezzlement. You drained a minor's trust fund to buy your own biological daughter a golden life. And you are arrogant enough to confess to these federal crimes right in front of a corporate attorney who is currently recording every single word you say. David tapped his sleek silver pen against his legal pad. Title 18, United States Code Section 1341, David stated smoothly. Fraud and swindles, combined with misappropriation of fiduciary funds, you are looking at a mandatory minimum of 20 years, Thomas. And that does not even factor in the civil penalties we will seek for the theft of Caroline's original shares. Brenda let out a sharp gasp. She grabbed Thomas by his jacket sleeve, her designer rings digging into the expensive fabric. Thomas, tell them you are joking, she pleaded, her voice cracking with sheer panic. Tell them you have a defense. They are going to send you to federal prison and leave me with absolutely nothing. I expected Thomas to panic. I expected the realization of his legal peril to finally break his massive, suffocating ego. I expected him to beg for a settlement to offer me whatever remaining liquid capital he had hidden away to keep this out of federal court. Instead, Thomas let out a low, dark chuckle. The sound was entirely devoid of fear. He gently removed Brenda's trembling hand from his sleeve and adjusted his collar. He sat back in the heavy leather chair and looked at David with a chilling, triumphant smirk. "You really think you are the smartest guy in the room?" David Thomas mocked, his voice dripping with pure condescension. "You think you can walk into my life, audit my accounts, and threaten me with federal prison? You think I built a multi-million-dollar logistics empire by being careless? I survived 30 years in the most cutthroat industry in this country. I do not leave loose ends." Thomas reached into the inside pocket of his custom-tailored suit. He slowly pulled out a crisp, folded legal document. He placed it deliberately on the table and slid it across the smooth black walnut surface until it stopped right in front of my hands. "I knew this day would come," Caroline Thomas said, his eyes locking onto mine with absolute malice. "I knew that the second you figured out how to read a balance sheet, you would start digging into the family archives. I knew you were too smart and too stubborn to just let the past go. So I prepared a contingency plan. A perfectly legal, fully ironclad contingency plan." I looked down at the document. The bold header printed at the top of the page made the blood freeze in my veins. It was a durable power of attorney. It was dated exactly 2 weeks ago. I picked up the heavy parchment paper, my eyes scanning the dense legal jargon. The document granted Thomas absolute unrestricted authority over all my personal financial assets, including any unvested corporate shares, trust fund remnants, and historical equity tied to Apex Logistics. I flipped to the final page. There at the bottom of the signature line was my name. The signature was flawless. The loops, the slant, the exact pressure of the pen. It was a perfect, indistinguishable replica of my handwriting. Right next to it was a legitimate certified notary stamp belonging to a senior partner at a massive downtown wealth management firm. "This is a forgery," I stated, my voice remaining remarkably steady despite the sudden spike in my heart rate. "I never signed this document. I have never even met this notary." "Good luck proving that in front of a judge," Thomas sneered, leaning forward and resting his arms on the table. "The notary will swear under oath that you sat right across from him and signed it willingly. He owes me a very expensive favor. As far as the legal system is concerned, you gave me total unmitigated control over your financial destiny exactly 14 days ago." David reached over and pulled the document from my hands. His eyes darted across the text, his legal mind rapidly processing the implications of the forged contract. His jaw tightened, but he did not show a single ounce of panic. "A fake power of attorney does not erase 30 years of embezzlement." Thomas David shot back, his tone sharp and uncompromising. "It is just another felony to add to your indictment. It does not erase the past, but it completely destroys your future." Thomas laughed, a dark, victorious sound that echoed through the glass walls. "Because I did not just hold on to this piece of paper, David. I used it. I exercised my legal right as Caroline's authorized financial representative." Thomas turned his gaze back to me, his eyes shining with ruthless, cruel satisfaction. "You think you can take Apex Logistics away from me," Thomas taunted. "You think you can reclaim your dead father's throne. You are too late, Caroline. Yesterday morning, while you and David were busy harassing my crying wife in your office, I executed a massive corporate transfer. I took every single original share tied to your name, every ounce of equity that rightfully belonged to your trust fund, and I legally transferred all of it. Transferred it where David demanded, his voice dropping to a dangerous, icy level. To Zenith, Digital Innovations. Thomas smiled, showing his teeth. I transferred your entire biological inheritance directly into Terrence's cryptocurrency corporation. I dispersed your shares into his offshore holding accounts in the Cayman Islands. They are entirely digitized, decentralized, and completely out of your reach. The sheer audacity of the maneuver hit me like a physical blow to the chest. My breath caught as the devastating reality of the situation rapidly set in. Thomas had not just stolen my company. He had weaponized my own identity to do it. He had forged my signature to legally hand my multi-million-dollar birthright over to the very man who was currently sitting in federal custody. Brenda let out a sharp gasp, covering her mouth with her hands. She looked at Thomas with a mixture of horror and awe. She finally realized the absolute depravity of the man she had married. "You gave it to Terrence?" I said, my voice dangerously quiet. "You transferred the remaining equity of Apex Logistics to a man the FBI just arrested for massive wire fraud." "Exactly," Thomas beamed, leaning back and crossing his arms behind his head. "Terrence's accounts are completely frozen by the Securities and Exchange Commission. His assets are locked in an endless, convoluted federal nightmare. It will take the government a decade to untangle his digital blockchain mess, which means your shares are trapped in federal purgatory, Caroline. You cannot touch them. You cannot sell them. You cannot use them to seize control of my board of directors." Thomas stood up from the heavy leather chair, buttoning his suit jacket, with a slow, deliberate motion. He looked down at me, savoring what he believed was his ultimate, undisputed victory. "You wanted to play corporate warfare with me," Thomas said, his voice dripping with arrogant finality. "You thought you could drag me into a law firm and force me to surrender. But you are just a naive little accountant, Caroline. I am the king of this empire, and I will burn it to the ground before I ever let you sit on the throne. Enjoy spending the next 10 years fighting the federal government for your stolen shares." "Let us go, Brenda." Thomas turned on his heel and marched toward the heavy oak doors of the conference room. Brenda scrambled to her feet, clutching her designer purse and rushing blindly after him, desperate to escape the toxic fallout. The heavy doors clicked shut behind them, leaving David and me alone in the expansive glass room. The silence was deafening. Thomas had just executed a flawless legal checkmate. He had used my own name to lock my legacy inside a federal vault, ensuring I could never use it against him. He thought he had completely neutralized our attack. He thought he had permanently outsmarted the forensic accountant and the corporate lawyer. David slowly placed the forged power of attorney back onto the black walnut table. He did not look defeated. He looked at the document with a cold, calculating precision. I looked at my husband, my mind racing through thousands of digital ledgers and encryption codes. Thomas thought he had trapped us in a dead end, but he forgot one crucial detail about digital currency and federal seizures. Nothing on the blockchain is ever truly inaccessible if you know exactly how to crack the code. The game was not over. The board had just completely changed. We left the glass conference room and drove straight to our secure home office. The sun had long set over the city skyline, but our night was just beginning. My husband had built a fortress of legal protection around us, but now we needed the raw digital ammunition to detonate Thomas and his fabricated empire. I walked into my workspace and powered up my triple monitor array. This was no longer a boardroom negotiation. This was a digital war zone, and forensic accounting was my absolute undisputed territory. My phone vibrated violently against the desk. It was an automated alert I had discreetly configured on the Apex Logistics employee portal months ago, just in case my so-called father ever tried to manipulate the legacy archives. The notification flashed across my screen in glaring red text. A massive unauthorized data purge was currently executing across the primary Apex corporate servers. Thomas was not just sitting back and admiring his forged power of attorney. He had hired a black hat contractor to completely wipe the historical databases. He was actively destroying the original ledger entries, the digital trust fund receipts, and the exact transactional history that proved he stole the company from my biological father. David leaned over my shoulder, his eyes tracking the rapidly deleting files displayed on the monitor. "He is burning the digital evidence," David stated, his voice tight with sharp calculation. "If he wipes the server origins, that forged power of attorney becomes the only surviving legal document. He is trying to erase your biological father from the corporate history permanently." I cracked my knuckles and let out a cold, dismissive laugh. "Thomas thinks deleting a file from a commercial server is like throwing a piece of paper into a fireplace," I said, my fingers already flying across my mechanical keyboard. "He is an outdated boomer CEO playing a digital game he does not understand. Data never actually burns, David. It just shatters into millions of microscopic hexadecimal fragments. And I happen to be exceptionally good at putting broken pieces back together. I launched my proprietary forensic recovery software, while Thomas paid some amateur hacker to execute a standard zero-fill overwrite. I was bypassing the primary server entirely. I deployed an algorithmic probe into the automated redundant shadow backups that modern corporate systems generate without the executive board even knowing. It is a fail-safe protocol designed for catastrophic hardware failure. Tonight, it was my personal backdoor into Thomas and his darkest financial secrets. The digital race began. David took the seat next to me, pulling out his high-encrypted laptop. We worked in perfect synchronized harmony. While I reconstructed the shattered database architectures, David leveraged his corporate law credentials to access international registry databases. We were a two-person tactical strike team operating in the dead of night. The only sounds in the room were the rapid clicking of our keyboards and the low hum of the processors running at maximum capacity. I isolated the specific time frame of the trust fund depletion, the screen filled with lines of chaotic, corrupted code. I applied a decryption sequence filtering out the white noise and targeting the specific metadata footprints attached to Thomas and his executive credentials. Slowly, the deleted ledgers began to reconstruct themselves on my center monitor. Ghost transactions reappeared from the digital graveyard. Look at this routing sequence, I instructed, pointing to a newly stabilized column of financial data. Thomas did not just transfer my shares to Terrence yesterday. He structured a highly complex liquidity extraction. He liquidated $4.5 million in corporate assets disguised as offshore consulting fees and pushed them through a labyrinth of shell companies before they ever hit the cryptocurrency exchange. David typed furiously, cross-referencing the employer identification numbers I read aloud. Shell Company number 1 is registered in Delaware under a fake LLC. David confirmed, his eyes scanning the corporate registry. Shell Company number 2 is a blind trust in Panama. And Shell Company number 3 is an empty holding firm in the Cayman Islands directly tied to Terrence and his fraudulent crypto syndicate. Thomas layered the transactions to trigger the Securities and Exchange Commission freeze intentionally. I nodded, keeping my eyes glued to the cascading data. Thomas deliberately fed my inheritance into a frozen federal account. He knew the government would lock it down the second the wire fraud indictment hit Terrence. It was a kamikaze financial maneuver designed to make my money completely untouchable by anyone, including himself. He sacrificed $4.5 million of stolen capital just to ensure I could never use those shares to vote him out of the chief executive officer chair. We pushed deeper into the blockchain network. Terrence thought cryptocurrency was a ghost town where money vanished without a trace. He paraded around the country club boasting about decentralized finance. But the blockchain is literally a public ledger. Every single digital coin leaves an immutable, permanent fingerprint if you possess the algorithmic tools to track the nodes. I deployed a tracing algorithm specifically designed for forensic audits in federal embezzlement cases. The software bypassed the superficial wallet addresses and hunted for the underlying transaction hashes. We sat in the dark office, fueled by black espresso and pure relentless determination. Hours bled into one another. The city outside our window remained silent, but our digital battlefield was loud with devastating revelations. "Got you," I whispered, leaning closer to the monitor as a massive breakthrough illuminated the screen. I shattered the final layer of encryption surrounding the Cayman Island Shell Company. The raw, unfiltered banking data poured onto my screen, providing a crystal-clear chronological map of every single stolen dollar. The entire 30-year timeline of Thomas and his financial crimes was laid bare. I had the exact dates, the precise amounts, and the digital signatures linking Thomas to the unauthorized draining of my biological father and his trust fund. I also had the irrefutable proof that Thomas forged the power of attorney to execute yesterday and his malicious share transfer. But as I scrolled through the final batch of decoded cryptocurrency transactions, an aggressive, glaring anomaly caught my attention. The numbers did not align with Thomas and his grand master plan. The federal freeze executed by the Securities and Exchange Commission locked down the primary wallets. But a secondary, highly obfuscated digital wallet was actively draining funds just hours before the federal agents kicked down Terrence and his door. I ran a rapid diagnostic on the secondary wallet, tracing the destination IP address. My heart pounded with a sudden sharp thrill of discovery. Thomas thought he had orchestrated the perfect corporate checkmate. He thought he had used Terrence as the ultimate disposable pawn to trap my inheritance. But Thomas had severely underestimated the sheer desperation of a cornered con artist. The data on my screen painted a spectacular picture of greedy, pathetic betrayal. I turned to my husband, a wide, predatory smile spreading across my face. "David," I said, pointing at the flashing red transaction log. "Thomas just lost his entire empire because his golden son-in-law is vastly more treacherous than he ever calculated. Look closely at the timestamps on these routed transfers," I instructed, pointing a manicured finger at the glowing monitor. Thomas authorized the corporate liquidation and pushed $4.5 million of my stolen inheritance into the Cayman Islands Shell Company at exactly 11:45 last night. He timed it perfectly. He knew the Securities and Exchange Commission would execute their federal freeze on Terrence and his assets at 8 o'clock this morning. Thomas intentionally parked the money on the tracks right before the federal train hit, so it would be locked in government custody for a decade. David leaned closer, resting his hands on the back of my ergonomic chair. His eyes scanned the cascading lines of hexadecimal code and banking routing numbers. "That is a textbook scorched earth legal strategy," David noted, his voice laced with professional disgust. "He burned his own stolen capital just to ensure you could never access your biological father and his company shares. It is pure malicious sabotage." I let out a sharp, cynical laugh that echoed in the quiet home office. "It would be a brilliant strategy," I replied, my fingers flying across the mechanical keyboard, if Thomas had not trusted a desperate con artist to hold the bag. Terrence knew the feds were closing in. He knew the walls of his fake cryptocurrency empire were collapsing. You do not run a Ponzi scheme without having an exit strategy built into the code. I opened a new terminal window and ran a deep decryption script on the specific blockchain wallet tied to the Cayman account. Terrence did not leave the money sitting there waiting for the government freeze. He installed an automated sweep protocol on his offshore servers. The screen flashed as the forensic software visualized the money trail. The exact second the $4.5 million cleared the international wire transfer from Apex Logistics at 11:46 last night, the sweep protocol triggered. Terrence did not even wait 60 seconds. The script instantly converted the massive corporate deposit into untraceable digital privacy coins. It then scattered the funds across 40 different decentralized exchanges in a matter of minutes, rendering the cash completely invisible to a standard bank audit. He washed the money, David stated, a cold, predatory smile forming on his lips. Thomas handed him a golden parachute, and Terrence immediately tossed it into a digital blender. I nodded, my eyes tracking the fragmented data packets hopping across international servers. But Terrence is not a mastermind, David. He is a greedy amateur who likes to spend money in the real world. You cannot buy a lavish lifestyle with privacy coins unless you eventually convert them back into fiat currency. I just need to find his designated off-ramp. I deployed a secondary tracking algorithm focusing entirely on offshore banking institutions known for lax regulatory oversight. We sat in silence for 20 minutes, watching the software chew through thousands of global transaction nodes. Suddenly, the screen locked onto a massive consolidated deposit, hitting a private wealth management bank in the Republic of Seychelles. "Got the offshore account," I announced, highlighting the routing number. "Now let us see exactly what our visionary entrepreneur was planning to do with my stolen inheritance." I breached the superficial security layers of the Seychelles account, pulling up the most recent ledger activity. The majority of the $4.5 million was sitting idle, waiting to be accessed. But Terrence had already executed 2 massive wire transfers just hours before the federal agents kicked down his door this morning. David leaned in, squinting at the vendor identification codes attached to the recent wire transfers. He cross-referenced the merchant identification numbers on his laptop. A low, dark chuckle rumbled in his chest. "Caroline, you are going to love this," David said, turning his screen toward me. "Terrence did not just steal your father and his money. He used it to fund his grand escape. Those two wire transfers went directly to an international luxury travel concierge and a private aviation charter company. I pulled the invoice data decoding the digital receipts. The sheer poetic justice of the situation was absolutely staggering. Terrence had purchased two one-way first-class tickets on a private jet scheduled to depart from a discreet regional airport at midnight tonight. The flight plan was logged for a direct route to Montenegro, a country famously known for having absolutely no extradition treaty with the United States. "And let me guess," I said, leaning back in my chair and crossing my arms. "The second passenger on that private flight to the Balkans is not my weeping sister." David typed a few commands, pulling up the passenger manifest secured by the charter company. "Not even close," David replied, his tone dripping with lethal satisfaction. "Passenger 1 is Terrence. Passenger 2 is Jasmine Carter, the 24-year-old fitness model he bought the Boca Raton mansion for." The reality of the situation settled over the room like a heavy, suffocating blanket of irony. Thomas had committed federal corporate theft, forged a power of attorney, and destroyed his entire relationship with me just to protect his golden family. He thought he was playing a masterful game of legal chess, but in reality, he had just handed his entire stolen fortune directly to a cowardly fraudster who was actively packing his bags to flee the continent with his mistress. Terrence was going to leave the country with my $4.5 million, leaving Thomas to face the full wrath of the Securities and Exchange Commission, and leaving Stephanie crying alone in a foreclosed mansion. "Thomas tried to use Terrence as a federal meat shield," I stated, staring at the flight manifest. But Terrence was planning to leave Thomas holding the bag for the entire corporate embezzlement scheme. They are both treacherous, arrogant sociopaths who just mutually assured their own absolute destruction. "We have the flight manifest, the offshore routing numbers, and the exact timestamp of the fraudulent corporate transfer," David summarized, cracking his knuckles. "The federal agents currently interrogating Terrence in a windowless room downtown have absolutely no idea about this Seychelles account or the private jet. We hold the only map to the stolen millions, Caroline. We possess the ultimate legal leverage over every single person in your toxic family." Before I could respond, my cell phone lit up on the desk. The caller identification displayed a name that made my blood run ice cold. It was Thomas. I stared at the glowing screen. Thomas had not called me directly in over 5 years. He had spent the entire evening watching his public reputation burn to ash at the country club. For him to call me at 2 in the morning meant he had finally realized the federal walls were closing in. He did not know that Terrence had stolen the money yet. He only knew that the government was tearing apart his logistics empire. I answered the call, placing the phone on the center of the desk and activating the speakerphone. Caroline, Thomas said, his voice lacking its usual booming arrogance. It sounded thin, desperate, and laced with underlying panic. "We need to talk. Just you, me, and your mother. I want you and David to come to the house for dinner tomorrow night. We are going to settle this family dispute right now." I looked at David, a slow, dangerous smile spreading across my face. I reached forward and tapped the microphone. "We would be absolutely delighted to attend dinner, Thomas," I replied, my voice perfectly smooth and accommodating. "We have so much to discuss regarding the future of your company." I ended the call and severed the connection. Thomas thought he was inviting me over to negotiate a surrender. He thought he could buy my silence and manipulate me into taking the fall for his crimes. He had absolutely no idea that I was walking into his dining room with a loaded digital shotgun, ready to blow his entire fake legacy to pieces. The heavy iron gates of the sprawling estate swung open slowly, groaning under their own massive weight. David navigated his sleek sports car up the winding paved driveway, illuminated by perfectly spaced landscape lighting. The property looked exactly as it always had, an intimidating monument to stolen wealth and fabricated prestige. I looked at the perfectly manicured lawns and the towering marble columns of the front entrance. It was incredibly difficult to believe that by this time tomorrow, federal agents would be taping foreclosure notices to those exact custom doors. We stepped out of the car and walked up the grand stone staircase. I did not bother ringing the doorbell. I simply pushed the heavy oak doors open and stepped right into the extravagant foyer. The smell of catered roasted lamb and expensive imported wine hung heavily in the air. It was a suffocating, desperate scent of a family actively trying to pretend the entire world was not collapsing around them. Brenda emerged from the formal dining room. She had clearly spent hours trying to reconstruct her flawless socialite facade. She wore a tailored dark silk dress and a heavy diamond necklace, but the effort was entirely wasted. Her eyes were severely bloodshot, and they darted around the grand foyer with a frantic, nervous energy. She rushed forward, throwing her arms open wide as if we were arriving for a casual, pleasant Sunday supper. "Caroline, darling, you came!" she exclaimed, her voice pitching into a forced, theatrical warmth that made my skin crawl. "We are so incredibly happy you are here." I sidestepped her attempted embrace, leaving her arms hovering awkwardly in the empty space between us. I handed my trench coat to the silent, terrified housekeeper standing in the corner and offered Brenda a razor-sharp smile. "You sounded quite desperate on the phone yesterday, Brenda," I replied, smoothing the fabric of my pencil skirt. "And as a forensic accountant, I have a strict professional obligation to attend the scenes of massive financial disasters." David stepped up beside me, offering a polite, tight nod that contained absolutely zero genuine respect. "Good evening," Brenda, David said, his voice perfectly smooth and lethal. "Thank you for having us. I assume we are dining quickly before the federal marshals arrive to seize the dining room table." Brenda let out a strangled, nervous laugh, fluttering her manicured hands as she ushered us toward the dining room. "Oh, David always making those dark legal jokes," she stammered, her expensive heels clicking rapidly on the hardwood floor. "Let us just leave the nasty business talk at the door tonight. Tonight is strictly about family. It is about healing and coming together." We entered the formal dining room. Thomas sat at the head of the massive mahogany table, looking exactly like a dethroned king, clinging desperately to a broken crown. He wore a dark, tailored suit, but the knot of his silk tie was slightly loose. The heavy, dark bags under his eyes betrayed the undeniable fact that he had not slept a single minute since the country club disaster. He gestured to the two empty chairs on his right. "Sit down," he commanded, attempting to project his usual booming authority. "The private caterers have prepared an exceptional meal for us." We took our seats. The long table was set with fine china crystal water glasses and heavy silver cutlery. It was an elaborate, expensive theater production deliberately designed to manipulate me into submission. Brenda took the seat directly across from me, immediately reaching for her wine glass with visibly trembling fingers. She took a massive, desperate gulp before setting the crystal glass down with a sharp clink. I looked at the lavish spread of catered food and then directly at the man who had stolen my biological father and his entire legacy. "You must have a truly remarkable line of credit," Thomas Fuss observed casually, picking up my linen napkin. "Considering the Securities and Exchange Commission froze your primary accounts yesterday morning, I am absolutely fascinated to know which offshore shell company paid for this roasted lamb." Thomas slammed his fist onto the table, rattling the expensive silverware. "I told you to leave that arrogant attitude at the door, Caroline," he growled, his face flushing a dangerous shade of dark red. "We are not here to discuss federal freezes or corporate audits. We are here to fix this broken family. We are here to find a viable solution that protects the Apex Logistics empire from the government." Brenda immediately burst into tears right on cue. It was a highly rehearsed, pathetic performance. She dabbed at her dry eyes with a linen napkin, letting out loud, dramatic sobs that echoed off the high ceilings. "Please, Caroline," she wailed, reaching her hand across the wide mahogany table. "You have to stop this absolute madness. You are tearing us apart. We are your flesh and blood. Family is supposed to protect each other when times get difficult. You cannot just stand by and watch your father lose everything he spent his entire life building." I stared at her outstretched hand, completely repulsed by her toxic psychological manipulation. "You are not my flesh and blood, Brenda," I stated, my voice dropping to a cold, lethal register. "You are just the woman who cheated on my real father and then allowed her arrogant husband to steal my trust fund. Do not sit there and cry to me about family protection. Where was your maternal instinct when I was eating instant noodles to pay off the massive student loans you forced me to take? Where was your profound family loyalty when you bought Stephanie a luxury vehicle using my stolen inheritance? Brenda gasped, pulling her hand back quickly, as if I had physically burned her. She looked at Thomas for backup, her face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated victimhood. Thomas leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. He attempted to soften his hardened expression, forcing a sickeningly fake look of paternal concern. We made mistakes. Caroline Thomas admitted the lie, clearly tasting foul even as he spoke the words. We let pride get in the way of our relationship. But we can move past this. We can heal as a family. You are a brilliant accountant, and David is a brilliant attorney. If we work together, we can untangle this digital mess. We can handle the federal investigators. We just need to stand as a united front against the government. David picked up his crystal water glass, taking a slow, deliberate sip before setting it down. There is no united front, Thomas. David said, his tone dripping with absolute professional mockery. You committed wire fraud, corporate embezzlement, and fiduciary theft. The federal government has a 98% conviction rate in these specific types of financial crimes. The only thing waiting for you is a very small concrete cell. Brenda let out a loud, hysterical sob, burying her face in her hands. You cannot let them take him. Caroline, she cried, her voice muffled by her palms. Stephanie is a complete wreck right now. Terrence is sitting in federal custody and Stephanie just found out she is pregnant. She is expecting a child, Caroline. You cannot let your pregnant sister lose her father and her husband in the exact same week. It will completely destroy her. The stunning revelation hung heavily in the suffocating air of the dining room. Stephanie was pregnant. They were actually using an unborn child as a human shield to beg for federal immunity. The sheer absolute depravity of their manipulation was staggering. They genuinely expected me to feel pity. They expected me to drop a federal investigation and risk my own professional licenses to protect a golden child who had spent her entire life trying to ruin mine. I looked at Thomas and Brenda, feeling a profound, overwhelming sense of disgust. The dinner was a suffocating trap built entirely on desperate lies, toxic guilt, and emotional extortion. But I was not the fragile prey they thought I was. Thomas silenced Brenda with a sharp, aggressive wave of his hand. He adjusted his tailored suit jacket, attempting to project the false, unwavering authority of a cornered dictator. He reached into his inner breast pocket and extracted a crisp, rectangular slip of paper. He placed it deliberately onto the polished mahogany table and slid it directly toward me. The paper stopped perfectly parallel to my crystal water glass. I did not reach for it. I simply looked down at the heavy black ink. It was a certified cashier check. The amount was printed in bold, undeniable numbers. $1 million. Take it, Thomas commanded, his voice dripping with arrogant expectation. That is your exit strategy, Caroline. You take that check right now and you clear this entire federal mess up by tomorrow morning. I am absolutely fascinated to know how exactly $1 million clears a federal wire fraud indictment, David stated, leaning back in his chair and steepling his fingers. The Department of Justice generally does not accept bribes written on personal bank checks, Thomas. It is not a bribe, Thomas snapped, his eyes locking onto mine with absolute venom. It is compensation. Stephanie is carrying my grandchild. She needs her husband by her side. Terrence is currently sitting in a federal holding cell because of the forensic audit you submitted. So you are going to march into the United States Attorney's Office tomorrow morning and you are going to submit a formal, immediate retraction. You will sign a sworn affidavit stating that you manipulated the financial ledgers. You will confess that you acted as a rogue accountant and orchestrated the offshore transfers yourself to frame your brother-in-law out of personal spite. The sheer staggering audacity of his demand hung heavily in the suffocating air of the dining room. He wanted me to commit federal perjury. He wanted me to destroy my spotless professional license, confess to a massive financial crime I did not commit, and go to federal prison just so his golden child could have her fraudulent husband back. I looked at the check and let out a sharp, razor-thin laugh. You value my freedom and my professional career at exactly $1 million, I said, my tone entirely devoid of shock. You stole 4.5 million from my biological father to fund your lavish lifestyle, but you only offer me a fraction of my own inheritance to take the fall for your criminal son-in-law. Your mathematics are almost as insulting as your parenting skills. It is a remarkably generous offer. Brenda shrieked, her hands gripping the edge of the table so tightly her knuckles turned white. You are young, Caroline. You can start over after you serve a little time in a minimum security facility. Stephanie cannot raise a baby alone. She is incredibly fragile right now. You have always been the strong one. You owe this family a sacrifice. I owe this family absolutely nothing. I shot back, my voice dropping to a dangerous, icy level. Terrence made his bed when he stole from a federal logistics account and tried to flee to Montenegro with his 24-year-old mistress. I am not setting myself on fire to keep your pregnant princess warm. You can take this check and use it to buy Stephanie a very nice box of tissues because her husband is never seeing the outside of a maximum security penitentiary. Thomas slammed his heavy fists onto the mahogany table. The crystal glasses rattled violently and the expensive silverware clattered against the fine china. The veins in his neck bulged as his false composure completely shattered. He stood up, towering over the table like a desperate cornered animal, lashing out with everything he had left. You will sign the federal confession! Caroline Thomas roared, his face turning a sickening shade of purple. You will take the fall for this company, or I swear to God I will completely annihilate the man sitting next to you. David did not flinch. He simply tilted his head, observing Thomas with the clinical detachment of a scientist studying a dying insect. You think I did not prepare for your stubbornness? Thomas snarled, pointing a shaking, angry finger directly at my husband. I have offshore accounts registered in David and his name. I have fabricated wire transfers linking his corporate law firm directly to the Cayman Island shell companies. I have a drafted ethics complaint ready to be delivered to the State Bar Association tomorrow morning. I will have him permanently disbarred. I will have him indicted as a primary co-conspirator. I will absolutely destroy his entire legal career and make sure you both end up destitute and rotting in adjacent federal cells. The room went deathly quiet. Brenda gasped, looking at Thomas with a mixture of horror and awe. She truly believed her husband had just delivered the ultimate unanswerable checkmate. She believed the threat of destroying David would finally break my resolve and force me into absolute submission. You fabricated offshore accounts in my name, David asked, his tone dripping with sheer professional mockery. Thomas, I am a senior partner at a corporate law firm that represents multinational banks. Do you honestly believe a fabricated wire transfer executed from a compromised IP address is going to withstand a basic federal subpoena? You are trying to play high-stakes legal warfare with a plastic toy gun. The State Bar Association will not even open that envelope before tossing it directly into the shredder. And Brenda, I added, turning my piercing gaze to the weeping woman across the table, you spent my entire life telling me I was a disappointment. Now you want me to sacrifice my freedom for a sister who laughed when I was pushed to the floor. You want me to trade a corner office for a prison cell so your precious golden child does not have to experience the real world. That is not maternal love. That is clinical insanity. I did not panic. I did not scream or beg for mercy. I simply reached across the table and picked up my crystal glass of imported red wine. I held it up to the light, admiring the deep ruby color for a brief moment. I took a slow, deliberate sip, savoring the expensive vintage, while Thomas stood there trembling with unhinged, impotent rage. I set the glass down with a soft, decisive clink. You are threatening the absolute wrong person, Thomas. I said, my voice perfectly smooth and radiating absolute lethal calm. You think I came to this house tonight to negotiate a settlement. You think I came here to look at a pathetic check or listen to your fabricated threats against my husband. But you severely miscalculated my professional strategy. Thomas frowned, his breathing heavy and erratic. What are you talking about? He demanded, his voice wavering. I did not come here to take your money, I stated, leaning back in my chair and crossing my arms. I came here to stall for time. Right on cue, the synchronized piercing wail of heavy police sirens shattered the quiet suburban night. The sound tore through the thick walls of the dining room, growing exponentially louder by the second. The flashing reflection of intense red and blue emergency lights suddenly flooded through the massive front windows, painting the opulent dining room in the frantic colors of federal justice. The vehicles did not just pass by. The heavy tires screeched against the pavement, stopping directly in the circular driveway of the sprawling estate. Heavy car doors slammed forcefully outside. Thomas froze completely. The arrogant threat died instantly in his throat. The blood drained entirely from his face, leaving him looking pale and utterly hollow. He stared at the flashing blue and red lights dancing across the dining room wall, the reality of his total destruction finally crashing down upon him. The reign of the fake patriarch was officially over. The heavy oak doors of the grand foyer did not just open, they were forcefully pushed apart by the sheer weight of federal authority. 6 agents wearing dark tactical jackets bearing the golden seals of the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the Securities and Exchange Commission marched into the opulent entryway. Their heavy boots struck the imported marble floor with a resounding, terrifying finality. Thomas stood frozen in the dining room, his chest heaving, his face completely drained of color. He slowly raised his trembling hands, holding his wrists together in a pathetic gesture of absolute surrender, anticipating the cold bite of steel handcuffs. But the lead federal agent, a tall, imposing man with a remarkably calm demeanor, did not reach for his restraints. He stepped into the dining room, pulling a crisp legal document from his jacket. "Put your hands down, Thomas," the agent commanded, his voice echoing through the silent mansion. "You are not going to a holding cell tonight. You have been formally subpoenaed by federal mandate. The board of directors at Apex Logistics has initiated an emergency shareholder assembly, and your physical presence is legally required. We are here to ensure you do not miss your final corporate engagement." Thomas blinked, his arrogant mind struggling to process the sudden shift in protocol. He looked wildly at David, and then at me. This was not a standard arrest. This was a highly coordinated public execution of his entire professional legacy. David offered a cold, razor-thin smile as he buttoned his tailored suit jacket. "We politely decline to negotiate in your dining room, Thomas," David stated, his tone ringing with absolute corporate dominance. "Because Caroline and I had already booked the grand auditorium at your corporate headquarters. Your audience is waiting." The drive to the financial district was a surreal, synchronized procession. Thomas was placed in the back of a black federal SUV flanked by armed agents. David and I followed closely behind in our sleek sports car, the flashing red and blue emergency lights illuminating the city streets. Thomas had spent 30 years commuting to this exact skyscraper in a chauffeured limousine, acting like an untouchable king. Tonight he was being escorted as a captive fraudster, entirely stripped of his power and his fabricated prestige. We walked through the towering glass doors of the Apex Logistics headquarters. The massive lobby, usually bustling with terrified employees bowing to their CEO, was deadly quiet. A perimeter of federal agents secured the elevators. Thomas was guided forward, his shoulders slumped, his expensive suit looking suddenly 2 sizes too big. He kept his eyes glued to the floor, entirely unable to face the disgusted stares of the late-night security staff. The double doors to the grand auditorium swung open, revealing a breathtaking scene of corporate accountability. The massive room was packed to absolute capacity. Every single member of the board of directors sat rigidly at the front tables. Hundreds of major shareholders, investors, and corporate partners filled the tiered seating. Dozens of federal regulators and financial crime investigators lined the walls, standing with their arms crossed. The atmosphere was suffocatingly tense, thick with angry whispers and profound betrayal. As Thomas was escorted down the center aisle, the whispers abruptly ceased. The silence that fell over the auditorium was deafening and infinitely more punishing than any screaming crowd. He was forced into a single isolated chair, positioned directly in front of the massive presentation stage. He was completely trapped, surrounded by the very people he had systematically defrauded for decades. I did not hesitate. I walked up the short flight of stairs and stepped confidently up to the sleek acrylic podium. The bright stage lights illuminated my tailored pencil skirt and silk blouse. I was no longer the scapegoat daughter forced to sit at the overflow table. I was a senior forensic accountant stepping onto my absolute undisputed battlefield. I placed my encrypted laptop onto the podium and connected the primary display cable. The three massive projection screens behind me flared to life, casting a sharp blue glow across the darkened auditorium. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I began, my voice perfectly amplified and completely devoid of nervous hesitation. My name is Caroline. I am a certified forensic accountant, and I am here tonight to walk you through the largest and most sophisticated corporate embezzlement scheme in the history of this company. I tapped a key on my laptop. The screens instantly displayed the 30-year-old incorporation documents I had retrieved from the underground storage facility. The bold signatures and notary stamps were magnified for every single shareholder to see clearly. For 3 decades, Thomas has stood on this exact stage and claimed he built Apex Logistics from the ground up. I stated, my tone echoing with cold, analytical precision. That is a fabricated narrative. The foundational capital and the original 90% equity stake belonged entirely to my biological father. Upon his tragic death, Thomas manipulated the executor rights of my private trust fund. He diluted the original shares and committed severe fiduciary fraud to hijack the executive voting rights you currently recognize. A collective furious gasp swept through the auditorium. Board members leaned forward, their eyes wide with shock as they read the indisputable legal text projected above me. Thomas sank lower into his isolated chair, sweat pouring down his pale face. But historical theft is not why the federal authorities have locked down your corporate headquarters tonight. I continued, my fingers flying across the keyboard to transition the slide. I am here to present the exact location of your missing quarterly revenue. The massive screens shifted from yellowing paper documents to a hyper-modern digital map of global banking transactions. The complex web of offshore shell companies and cryptocurrency nodes illuminated the room. Yesterday morning, Thomas recognized that his fraudulent empire was facing an imminent federal audit. I explained, projecting the exact routing numbers and timestamps onto the display. In a desperate act of malicious sabotage, he authorized an illegal corporate liquidation. He drained $4.5 million of critical company assets, disguising the theft as offshore consulting fees. I zoomed in on the specific Cayman Island shell account, displaying the undeniable digital footprint linking the transaction directly to Thomas and his executive credentials. I did not stop there. I projected the forged durable power of attorney right next to the fraudulent wire transfer, proving exactly how he attempted to weaponize my identity to shield his corporate looting. This money was not invested into supply chain expansion, I announced, my voice ringing with lethal authority. It was funneled directly into a fraudulent cryptocurrency syndicate operated by his son-in-law, Terrence. Thomas deliberately pushed millions of your shareholder equity into a decentralized digital blender, hoping to permanently hide his theft behind a wall of blockchain encryption. He compromised the financial stability of this entire corporation simply to protect his own arrogant, fragile ego. The auditorium erupted. Shareholders jumped to their feet, shouting in pure, unadulterated outrage. The board of directors slammed their hands on the tables, their faces twisted in absolute fury, as they realized their entire financial portfolios had been gambled away by a desperate criminal. Thomas sat frozen in his chair, completely paralyzed by the sheer, crushing magnitude of his public annihilation. He looked up at the massive, glowing screens, staring at the undeniable mathematical proof of his total destruction. He had absolutely nowhere left to hide, and the night was far from over. The chaotic uproar inside the grand auditorium was abruptly silenced by the violent crashing of the heavy mahogany double doors at the back of the room. Every shareholder, board member, and federal investigator turned their heads simultaneously. A second highly tactical squad of federal agents marched aggressively down the center aisle. They were dragging a man who was fighting against his heavy steel handcuffs, his custom Italian leather shoes sliding desperately against the polished floor. It was Terrence. The self-proclaimed cryptocurrency visionary did not look like a wealthy tech entrepreneur anymore. He looked like a feral, panicked animal caught in a steel trap. The federal authorities had intercepted him directly on the tarmac of the regional airport, exactly as he was attempting to board his chartered private jet to Montenegro. His expensive silk shirt was torn at the collar, his designer jacket was missing, and his face was slick with a heavy, terrified sweat. The agents hauled Terrence forcefully to the front of the auditorium, dumping him unceremoniously into the empty space right next to Thomas. The two men who had spent years feeding each other arrogant delusions of grandeur now stared at one another in the harsh, unyielding light of federal justice. Terrence lifted his head, and his bloodshot eyes immediately locked onto the massive glowing projection screens towering behind my podium. He saw the decoded offshore routing numbers. He saw the Cayman Island shell accounts laid bare in high definition. He saw the exact forensic evidence of the $4.5 million wire transfer that he thought he had successfully washed through his decentralized blockchain network. The sheer magnitude of his exposure hit him with the force of a concrete wall. He realized in a fraction of a second that his entire escape plan was completely destroyed, and the federal government possessed the undeniable digital map of his entire criminal enterprise. The panic in his chest exploded into sheer, desperate self-preservation. Terrence did not attempt to maintain his sophisticated corporate facade. He instantly reverted to the cowardly street-level fraudster he truly was. He turned toward the board of directors and the federal regulators, raising his handcuffed wrists and pointing a shaking finger directly at the man sitting next to him. "He made me do it!" Terrence screamed, his voice cracking with hysterical, frantic terror. "Thomas is the mastermind. He orchestrated the entire corporate liquidation. He told me the Apex Logistics accounts were bleeding capital, and he forced me to use my digital servers to launder the stolen shareholder equity. I was just following the directives of the chief executive officer. He set me up to take the fall for his massive embezzlement scheme." Thomas shot out of his isolated chair, his face turning a dangerous, violently dark shade of purple. The wealthy patriarch completely lost his mind. He lunged toward his golden son-in-law, abandoning every single ounce of his carefully cultivated upper-class dignity. "You lying parasitic thief!" Thomas roared, spit flying from his mouth as he strained against the physical space separating them. "You stole my entire executive retirement fund. You drained my life savings to buy fake internet coins, and you tried to flee the continent with my company capital. You ruined my entire legacy." The two men stood in the center of the corporate auditorium, screaming vicious, absolute poison at one another. They threw each other to the federal wolves with zero hesitation, revealing the absolute lack of loyalty that defined their pathetic existence. The board of directors watched in pure, unadulterated disgust as the former CEO and his chosen successor degraded into a pair of feral, screaming criminals. I stood at the acrylic podium, resting my hands on the cool edges. I did not raise my voice to interrupt their pathetic brawl. I simply tapped the spacebar on my encrypted laptop. The massive projection screens behind me shifted with a sharp digital transition. "Let us discuss the exact nature of your unwavering loyalty to this family, Terrence," I announced, my voice slicing through their screaming match with icy, lethal precision. The screens illuminated with two crystal-clear, high-definition images. On the left was the official private aviation flight manifest, retrieved directly from the charter company's server. It clearly displayed Terrence and his scheduled departure to the Balkans. Right beneath his name in bold, undeniable print was the name of his sole traveling companion, Jasmine Carter. On the right side of the screen, I projected the real estate deed for the $2 million beachfront mansion in Boca Raton, highlighting the American Express transaction executed entirely on my sister and her credit line. A piercing, blood-curdling shriek suddenly tore through the heavy atmosphere of the auditorium. Stephanie had been escorted into the back of the room by corporate security alongside Brenda, just in time to witness the presentation. When my sister looked up at the massive projection screens and saw the undeniable legal proof of her husband buying a luxury estate for a 24-year-old fitness model, her entire fabricated reality completely snapped. The delusion she had clung to for her entire spoiled existence shattered into a million irreparable pieces. Stephanie pushed violently past a group of shocked investors, her designer gown tearing as she sprinted recklessly down the center aisle. She was no longer the smug, arrogant golden child who had mocked me at the country club. She was an unhinged, hysterical wreck. "You bought her a house with my credit card," Stephanie shrieked, her voice tearing at her vocal cords as she charged the front of the room. "You told me you were buying secure blockchain servers, you disgusting lying parasite." She did not stop to demand an explanation. Stephanie threw herself entirely at Terrence. She raised her manicured hands and began violently scratching and clawing at his face and chest. She beat her fists against his shoulders, screaming in pure primal agony as the public humiliation fractured her fragile narcissistic mind. Terrence stumbled backward, restricted by his heavy steel handcuffs, unable to defend himself against the feral onslaught of his enraged wife. Brenda collapsed to her knees in the middle of the corporate aisle, wailing uncontrollably. She pressed her hands to her face, sobbing loudly as she watched her perfect, flawless family physically tear each other to shreds in front of the most powerful financial regulators in the country. The elite socialites, the institutional investors, and the federal agents watched the spectacle in absolute stunned silence. The magnificent, wealthy dynasty Brenda had sold her soul to protect was reduced to a trashy, violent, screaming brawl right on the corporate floor. David stepped up to the podium, standing shoulder to shoulder with me. He gently placed his hand on the small of my back, offering a silent anchor of absolute strength. We looked down at the pathetic, highly destructive implosion of the toxic family unit. They were literally tearing each other apart, trying desperately to save their own miserable skins. They had spent 33 years operating as a unified front of manipulation and abuse. But the exact second the stolen money vanished, they turned into starving predators, cannibalizing their own flesh and blood without a single second of hesitation. The federal agents moved swiftly, pulling Stephanie off her fraudulent husband before she could draw any more blood. They restrained her erratic, flailing arms and pushed her back toward the velvet-lined walls of the auditorium. Terrence stood there, panting and bleeding from deep scratches across his cheek, completely ruined and humiliated in front of the very institutional investors he had hoped to impress. Brenda remained on her knees in the center aisle, weeping hysterically into her hands as the final shreds of her high society illusion dissolved into absolute dust. Thomas stood entirely alone at the front of the room. He looked at the furious faces of his board of directors. He looked at the federal investigators who were already stepping forward with a pair of heavy steel handcuffs meant exclusively for him. He looked at the massive, glowing projection screens displaying the undeniable digital proof of his corporate embezzlement and his 30-year theft of my biological father and his trust fund. The walls of his fabricated logistics empire were rapidly closing in, crushing him under the immense weight of federal law. He realized he had absolutely no legal defense left. He had no more forged documents to hide behind. He could not manipulate or buy his way out of an airtight federal indictment presented to a live audience of furious shareholders. The arrogant patriarch realized he was going to die in a federal penitentiary. So Thomas played the final, most pathetic and desperate card he had left in his losing hand. He suddenly clutched his chest, his face contorting into a mask of sudden, extreme physical agony. He let out a loud, dramatic gasp that echoed across the silent auditorium. He stumbled backward, hitting the edge of the front row table and knocking over a glass pitcher of ice water. The water shattered across the polished floor. Thomas dropped heavily to his knees, gripping his tailored shirt and squeezing his eyes shut. He began taking shallow, erratic breaths, putting on a spectacular theatrical performance of a man suffering a massive, fatal cardiac event. "My chest," he wheezed, his voice sounding painfully strained. "I cannot breathe. Call an ambulance. My heart is failing." Brenda let out a piercing, terrified shriek. She scrambled across the floor in her expensive silk dress, throwing her arms around his trembling shoulders. "He is having a heart attack," she screamed, looking wildly at the federal agents and the board members. "You are killing him. Someone call a doctor right now. Have some mercy. He is an old man. You cannot do this to him." The room erupted into a brief wave of panicked confusion. Several shareholders stood up, alarmed by the sudden medical emergency. One of the federal agents reached for his radio, ready to call for emergency medical services. But David did not call for an ambulance. My husband let out a sharp, razor-thin laugh that cut through the manufactured panic like a frozen blade. He reached into his leather briefcase resting on the podium and pulled out a crisp, perfectly sealed manila envelope. He walked slowly down the short flight of stairs from the presentation stage, his polished shoes echoing on the floor. He approached the pathetic scene unfolding in the center aisle. "Stand down, gentlemen," David instructed the federal agents, his voice radiating absolute uncompromising authority. The only thing Thomas is suffering from right now is the sudden catastrophic realization of his own accountability. David stood directly over my father, looking down at him with an expression of pure clinical disgust. He unsealed the manila envelope and pulled out a stack of official medical documents, stamped with the logo of the most prestigious private hospital in the city. "It is truly fascinating to watch you pretend your cardiovascular system is failing, Thomas," David announced, projecting his voice so every single shareholder in the room could hear the truth. "Especially considering the comprehensive executive health screening you mandated for yourself just 3 days ago. As the lead corporate counsel for the primary creditors, I subpoenaed your physical examination results this afternoon to ensure you were fit to stand trial." David tossed the thick medical file directly onto my father and his chest. The heavy papers scattered across the wet floor right in front of Brenda and her weeping face. "Your resting heart rate is optimal," David read aloud, quoting the diagnosis from memory. "Your blood pressure is absolutely perfect. Your cholesterol levels are completely normal, and your EKG shows zero signs of any arterial blockages or cardiovascular distress. You possess the heart of a perfectly healthy 62-year-old man. You are not having a heart attack, Thomas. You are having a panic attack because you can no longer manipulate your way out of a federal prison sentence." The sudden revelation hit the auditorium like a physical shockwave. The panicked murmurs instantly turned into loud, angry scoffs of absolute revulsion. The board members shook their heads in pure disgust, watching their former chief executive officer fake a deadly medical emergency just to escape taking responsibility for his massive financial crimes. Thomas stopped gasping. The theatrical, heavy breathing ceased entirely. He slowly opened his eyes, realizing his final desperate performance had been completely dismantled by cold, hard medical facts. He looked up at David, his face pale and entirely stripped of its remaining dignity. He was nothing but a pathetic, cornered fraud sitting in a puddle of spilled water. I stepped down from the acrylic podium, leaving my encrypted laptop behind. My heels clicked rhythmically against the polished floor as I walked down the aisle to stand right beside my husband. I looked down at the man who had spent 33 years calling me a disappointment. I looked at the woman who had allowed him to steal my inheritance to fund her golden child. I felt no anger anymore. I felt no sorrow. I felt the profound, overwhelming rush of absolute total victory. "You spent my entire life trying to make me feel small, Thomas," I stated, my voice echoing with unyielding corporate dominance. "You shoved me to the floor at your retirement party and told me I was not your real daughter. You were absolutely right. I am not your daughter. I am the daughter of the man who actually built this empire." I took a step closer, looking directly into his defeated, terrified eyes. "This CEO chair originally belonged to my biological father," I declared, sealing his fate in front of the entire corporate assembly. "Today, I officially reclaim it. The board of directors will vote you out by unanimous consent before midnight, and I will personally oversee the forensic restructuring of this entire corporation. As for you, Thomas, spend the rest of your miserable life paying off your debts from inside a federal cage. Take him away." The lead federal agent stepped forward, grabbing Thomas by the arms and hauling him roughly to his feet. The heavy steel handcuffs clicked securely around his wrists, finalizing the ultimate destruction of his fake legacy. The empire of lies was officially dead, and the true heir had finally taken the throne. The federal courthouse downtown was entirely stripped of the glamorous illusion my family had relied on for decades. The heavy wooden gavel of the United States District Judge struck the sounding block with a sharp, definitive crack. Thomas stood before the bench wearing a bright orange institutional jumpsuit that completely washed out his former corporate arrogance. The judge showed absolutely zero mercy. For massive corporate embezzlement, fiduciary fraud, and malicious misappropriation of a minor trust fund, Thomas received 25 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary. He did not look back at the gallery as the marshals led him away in heavy steel chains. Terrence stood next. The self-proclaimed cryptocurrency visionary sobbed openly as the judge handed down a 15-year federal sentence for international wire fraud and money laundering. There were no offshore accounts left to save him. The Securities and Exchange Commission had seized every single digital coin and handed it directly back to the defrauded creditors. David sat beside me in the gallery observing the absolute destruction of the criminals who had tried to ruin us. My husband simply adjusted his silk tie and nodded in profound satisfaction as the courtroom doors closed on their pathetic lives forever. The justice system moves with a devastating mechanical efficiency when it involves seizing assets bought with stolen corporate funds. 3 weeks after the sentencing, the federal marshals arrived at the sprawling suburban estate my parents had proudly called their kingdom. The bank had officially foreclosed on the property to liquidate it for immediate restitution. Brenda and Stephanie were given exactly 2 hours to vacate the premises. I drove my sedan and parked discreetly across the street simply to witness the glorious architectural collapse of their toxic dynasty. Federal agents systematically carried out flat-screen televisions, luxury artwork, and boxes of expensive jewelry. Because Thomas had funded their entire lives using my stolen inheritance, almost everything inside the mansion was legally categorized as seized federal property. Brenda and Stephanie were escorted out the front door, holding only 2 cheap canvas suitcases containing basic clothing. They stood on the edge of the pavement, completely stripped of their designer coats, their diamond rings, and their massive, fraudulent egos. The pristine neighborhood they had dominated for years now watched them through parted blinds, whispering viciously as the golden child and the enabling matriarch were literally thrown out onto the street. Later that evening, I was sitting in my secure home office reviewing the restructuring plans for Apex Logistics. My private cell phone vibrated sharply against the glass desk. The caller identification displayed a prepaid mobile number, but I knew exactly who was on the other end of the line. I answered the call, placing it on speakerphone so David could hear the desperate culmination of my mother and her spectacular downfall. Caroline Brenda wailed, her voice cracking with raw, unadulterated panic. "We have absolutely nowhere to go. The government took my credit cards. They took Stephanie and her sports cars. We are standing at a cheap roadside motel, and they will not even let us check in without a massive cash deposit. You have to help us. Please, Caroline, you have a massive house with high-tech security. Just let us stay in your guest rooms until we figure this out. We are your flesh and blood. You cannot just leave your mother and your pregnant sister freezing on the street." I leaned back in my ergonomic chair, staring at the digital ledgers glowing on my monitors. I remembered the country club. I remembered the cruel smirks, the blatant favoritism, and the 33 years of psychological abuse. I remembered Brenda explicitly telling me to go sit at the overflow table so she could protect the fragile ego of her fraudulent husband. "I'm afraid my high-tech security perimeter is incredibly strict, Brenda," I stated, my voice radiating absolute freezing calm. "You see, the guest rooms in my house are highly exclusive. The seats in my home are reserved solely for my real family." I tapped the screen, ending the call instantly. I permanently blocked the prepaid number and tossed the phone back onto the desk. David poured 2 glasses of imported red wine, handing one to me with a brilliant, triumphant smile. We clinked our crystal glasses together, celebrating the absolute silence that followed. There would be no more fake tears and no more toxic extortion. Reality is a remarkably cruel teacher for those who have spent their entire lives avoiding it. Without Thomas and his stolen corporate wealth, Stephanie was forced to actually enter the real world. The pregnant golden child who had spent decades mocking my work ethic suddenly found herself desperately needing a paycheck to afford basic rent. Because she possessed absolutely zero marketable skills and a thoroughly ruined public reputation, her employment options were drastically limited. 2 months later, David and I accepted an invitation to attend a prestigious charity brunch at the Oak Ridge Country Club. We walked into the grand ballroom, the exact same room where my father had violently shoved me to the floor. The environment had entirely shifted. The wealthy elite now greeted David and me with profound respect, recognizing us as the new undisputed power couple of the financial district. We sat at the center VIP table reviewing the charity auction catalog. A server approached our table carrying a heavy silver tray loaded with crystal flutes of expensive champagne. She was wearing the standard crisp black and white uniform, her hair tied back in a strict messy bun. The server looked down at the table and froze completely. It was Stephanie. The former socialite princess was now carrying heavy trays and fetching drinks for the exact same wealthy families she used to ruthlessly gossip about. Her hands trembled violently as she recognized my face, causing the crystal flutes to rattle dangerously against the silver tray. She looked exhausted, deeply humiliated, and thoroughly broken by the crushing weight of minimum wage labor. I did not mock her. I did not raise my voice or cause a theatrical scene. I simply looked at my sister, picked up a crisp $100 bill from my purse, and placed it deliberately onto her silver tray. "Keep the change, Stephanie," I said, my tone perfectly polite and utterly merciless. "I hear the cost of living is quite difficult when you actually have to earn your own money." Stephanie choked back a humiliated sob, turning sharply on her heel and fleeing back toward the swinging kitchen doors. I took a slow, satisfying sip of my champagne, watching the golden child disappear into the servant quarters. The brutal cycle of their toxic abuse was permanently destroyed, and the universe had finally balanced the heavy, expensive scales. Exactly 365 days after the federal government dismantled a fraudulent dynasty, I stood in the pinnacle of my reclaimed empire. The top-floor corner office of the downtown skyscraper was entirely unrecognizable. I had ordered corporate security to drag out every single piece of heavy, dark mahogany furniture that Thomas had used to project his toxic artificial authority. In its place, I installed sleek bulletproof glass, polished steel, and vibrant modern art. The suffocating atmosphere of secrecy and embezzlement was permanently eradicated. Fresh air and absolute transparency now ruled the executive suite. I walked over to the massive panoramic windows and looked out at the glittering financial district. The heavy gold-plated letters mounted on the wall behind my desk no longer read Apex Logistics. I had legally filed the corporate restructuring documents exactly 6 months ago. The enterprise was now officially operating under its rightful original title, Kensington Global Logistics. I had resurrected the name of my biological father, Jonathan Kensington, restoring the brilliant legacy that a parasitic fraudster had tried so desperately to erase. The forensic cleanup of the corporation had been a brutal, exhausting, and deeply satisfying battlefield. I did not just remove Thomas. I systematically audited every single department. I fired every complicit board member who had turned a blind eye to the missing millions. I ruthlessly purged the executive ranks of anyone who possessed even a fraction of the arrogance and greed that had defined the previous regime. I replaced them with sharp, hungry, and highly ethical professionals. Within a single fiscal year, our profit margins had skyrocketed. Without a fake cryptocurrency entrepreneur bleeding the accounts dry, the company was finally operating at its true massive potential. Tonight was the ultimate celebration of that brutal, highly successful reconstruction. The grand atrium of the Kensington corporate headquarters had been transformed into a breathtaking venue for our one-year anniversary gala. There were no country club socialites pretending to be important. There were no spoiled golden children demanding attention. The room was filled with brilliant financial minds, dedicated logistics partners, and the absolute elite of the legal and corporate world. I turned away from the window and smoothed the fabric of my emerald green evening gown. The heavy oak doors of my office opened, and David stepped inside. He looked dangerously handsome in his custom-tailored black tuxedo, his presence immediately filling the room with an undeniable comforting strength. He walked toward me, his eyes reflecting the brilliant city lights and the profound pride he held for the woman standing in front of him. "Are you ready to address your kingdom?" Madam Chief Executive Officer David asked, offering his arm with a flawless, charismatic smile. I looped my arm through his, feeling the solid, reassuring muscle beneath his tailored suit. I have never been more ready in my entire life, I replied, my voice ringing with absolute certainty. We took the private glass elevator down to the grand atrium. The moment the doors slid open, a wave of thunderous, genuine applause washed over the massive space. Hundreds of respected professionals turned toward us, raising their crystal champagne flutes in a unified gesture of absolute profound respect. I did not feel the need to shrink myself to make anyone else comfortable. I walked through the crowd with my head held high, absorbing the incredible energy of an empire built on truth rather than manipulation. David and I walked up the short flight of stairs to the illuminated presentation stage. The bright spotlights washed over us, but I did not blink. I looked out at the sea of faces and allowed myself a brief moment to remember the past. Exactly 1 year ago, I had been violently shoved to a marble floor by a man who called me a worthless obligation. I had been publicly mocked by a sister who thought her stolen wealth made her untouchable. I had been surrounded by a family that viewed my existence as a massive inconvenience. Tonight, those people were either sitting in a federal prison cell or wiping down tables for minimum wage while I stood at the absolute zenith of corporate power. I stepped up to the acrylic podium, adjusting the microphone. The expansive atrium fell into a perfectly respectful silence. 1 year ago, this corporation was suffocating under the heavy, destructive weight of massive financial deception. I began, my voice echoing with smooth, unwavering authority. We were tethered to a regime that prioritized personal greed and toxic ego over corporate responsibility and basic human decency. The foundation of this company was built by a brilliant man named Jonathan Kensington, but his vision was hijacked and buried in the dark. Tonight, we are not just celebrating a successful fiscal restructuring, we are celebrating the triumphant return of the truth. The crowd erupted into a fresh wave of applause. I let the sound wash over the room before raising my hand to quiet them. I looked directly at David, who was standing right beside me, his eyes radiating unwavering, fierce support. Throughout my entire life, I was repeatedly told a very specific, dangerous lie about what it means to be part of a family. I continued, my tone shifting to a deeply personal, resonant frequency. I was taught that family meant unconditional compliance. I was taught that blood ties require you to absorb emotional abuse, financial exploitation, and constant humiliation, simply to protect a fake, flawless public image. I was conditioned to believe that if you do not fit the impossible mold of a golden child, you are permanently destined to sit at the overflow table of life. I paused, letting the heavy truth of my words settle over the hundreds of guests. But the last 12 months have taught me the most valuable lesson of my existence. I stated, my voice rising with undeniable power. True family has absolutely nothing to do with shared DNA. Blood does not give anyone the right to trample you, to steal from you, or to diminish your hard-earned achievements. Family is not the group of people who shove you to the floor when you become an inconvenience to their fabricated reality. I reached out and took David by the hand, lacing my fingers tightly with his. True family is the person who stands up for you when the rest of the world tells you to sit down, I declared, looking proudly at my husband. Family is the person who helps you dust off your clothes after you have been pushed to the ground, and then systematically helps you dismantle the entire corrupt empire of the people who pushed you. Family is the relentless, unwavering shield that protects your peace, and the sharpened sword that defends your honor. I turned my gaze back to the crowd, offering a brilliant, victorious smile. To everyone standing in this room tonight, thank you for proving that an empire built on integrity will always outlast a kingdom built on lies. The future of Kensington Global Logistics is exceptionally bright, and I am incredibly honored to build it with all of you. The grand atrium exploded into a massive, deafening standing ovation. Shareholders and executives cheered, raising their glasses high into the air. The sound was not polite, obligatory clapping. It was the roaring, undeniable validation of a spectacular, hard-fought victory. David pulled me close, pressing a warm, proud kiss to my forehead. I stood under the bright stage lights, feeling the heavy, flawless weight of absolute freedom. The toxic chains of my past were permanently shattered. The villains of my story were locked away in concrete cages of their own making. I was no longer the scapegoat daughter hiding in the shadows of a fraudulent patriarch. I was the reigning, undisputed architect of my own magnificent destiny, and nobody would ever dare to take my seat again. The story of Caroline teaches us a profound and uncompromising truth about human relationships. We are often conditioned from childhood to believe that sharing DNA automatically guarantees unconditional love, loyalty, and respect. Society constantly tells us to forgive toxic parents and tolerate abusive siblings simply because they are blood relatives. However, this outdated narrative is a dangerous trap. It forces victims to endure endless emotional manipulation, financial exploitation, and psychological trauma just to maintain a fake, fragile picture of domestic harmony. The real lesson here is that family is an earned privilege and absolutely not a biological right. True family is defined by the people who stand fiercely by your side when you are pushed to the ground. It is the partner who shields you from public humiliation and helps you systematically dismantle the corrupt empires built by your abusers. Caroline realized that her personal worth was never tied to the validation of a fraudulent patriarch or a complicit mother. She learned that she possessed the ultimate power to sever those toxic roots and plant herself in an environment where she could truly thrive. We must immediately stop shrinking ourselves to fit into spaces where our presence is blatantly disrespected. Genuine healing begins the exact moment you stop seeking approval from people who are fundamentally committed to misunderstanding your value. You have the absolute moral right to walk away from abusers, to fiercely protect your peace, and to build a spectacular life on your own terms. Your undeniable success and your integrity are always your best defense against manipulation. When you finally reclaim your narrative and establish unbreakable boundaries, you stop being the silent scapegoat and officially become the powerful architect of your own magnificent destiny. If you have ever had to cut ties with a toxic environment to protect your peace, please share your story in the comments below and subscribe to our channel to join a community of strong survivors.